The Senate Special Committee on Hurricane and Tropical Storm Preparedness, Recovery, and Electricity will come to order. The clerk will call the roll.
Senator Schwartner.
Present.
Senator King.
Here.
Senator Alvarado.
Here.
Senator Betancourt. Senator Creighton.
Here.
Senator Hinojosa.
Present.
Senator Huffman.
Here.
Senator Kolkhorst.
Here.
Senator LaMantia.
Present.
Senator Middleton.
Here.
Senator Miles.
Here.
Senator Nichols.
Here.
Senator Zaffarini.
There being 13 present, a quorum is established. Good morning, members, and thank you all for your time and for your participation today. Before we get started, we need to take care of one piece of organizational business by adopting the committee rules. Members, our first order of business is to adopt our special committee rules for this legislative session. The rules have been provided to you prior to the meeting and are on your desk. These rules are standard to what Senate committees adopted during the regular legislative session have done. Are there any questions? Senator King moves adoption of the committee rules. Without objection, the chair hears none, and the rules are adopted. Members, this committee was formed for one reason only, and that is to answer two simple questions that Texans want answered. Why did 2.25 million people in the greater Houston area lose power? And why did it take 2 weeks to restore power fully? This committee was created so that the elected representatives of the people hit hardest can get those answers. I want to thank my fellow senators here today, many who suffered with their constituents during the storm and the days after. I know each member on this dais is fully attuned to the concerns of their constituents and the needs of Texans across our state. I want to thank the linemen who worked around the clock through severe weather and at times in the face of physical threats to restore power as quickly as possible. The fault lies not with them. The Texas Division of Emergency Management and our State Operations Center was tracking Hurricane Beryl across the clock, and assets were activated and preparing days before the storm reached our coast. I think it will be demonstrated today the seriousness the state acted with in anticipation of this hurricane, in contrast to the multitude of failures of CenterPoint that have been highlighted in the media and felt by millions of Texans. I've heard a variety of different reasons for why the outage of power was so great and the restoration of power took so long. Ineffective leadership, lack of seriousness regarding the storm, communication failures, poor planning, disorganized operations and coordination of mutual assistance, ineffective mobile generation equipment, and dereliction regarding vegetation management are all areas that we will explore. As we hear testimony of storm preparedness and recovery in the hours to come, it is my hope that by the end of the discussion today, we'll have a better understanding of actions the state may take through either regulation or legislation to ensure that this type of failure does not happen in Texas again. Now, members, I'd like to ask Vice Chair King and then any senator that would like to do so to share any opening statements or comments.
Thank you, Chairman. I just got a couple things. I was thinking about this driving down yesterday, and you know, this was a different kind of event for us. We've had, you know, Harvey was a water event. Lines and poles held up real well, but we had a lot of flooding. Uri was a generation event. The lines and poles weren't an issue. We just didn't have any power to put on them. We've had transmission events, the power lines from basically the generators to the substations. We've had those before with Rita and Katrina and Ike and others. This was only the second time I can remember that we had a major distribution event, just the problem being in the lines from the substation down to the consumer. We had a pretty good one last year here in Austin, and some of us, if you remember, were hanging out at the Capitol because we didn't have electricity at our apartments and homes, and that was all due to poor vegetation management, just ice and snowstorm, and it just weighted them down. You know, I know up in my neck of the woods we don't have the hurricane issue, but we do have tornadoes, but those are usually pretty isolated on the distribution side. But widespread, we have a lot of trouble with wildfires, and most of those wildfires are started by old lines that are loose and sway when we get the big winds in December and January and February or during the summer. And they sway and they hit, those distribution lines create sparks. The next thing we've got 5,000 acres under fire. Or the vegetation bounces on the lines, does the same thing, knocks the lines down, and we have a fire. This is the first time I can think of that we've ever had this level of distribution event, and I'm very, very appreciative that the Lieutenant Governor called the committee so we can kind of figure out what happened. Chairman, other than that, I do have a lot of questions about the mobile gen issue because that's something I've worked on and how that played out, and I would like it, with your permission, opportunity to ask questions when the appropriate time is for that.
Excellent. Yes, we'll have plenty of time for questions. Senator Hinojosa?
Just some brief comments. I'm happy to be here today, but it seems to me that as long as I can remember, since 1967, when Beulah hit the Rio Grande Valley, and we've had many more hurricanes hit the coastal area and other disasters, that by now our energy companies that are in charge of our electricity grid would have learned some lessons and best practices. It seems we continue to repeat and make some of the same mistakes that we made in the past that we have not learned. So maybe we need to look at some of the changes in terms of the way the state regulates some of these companies that seem, for whatever reason, unable to perform very basic responsibilities in taking care of our public when disasters hit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Nichols? Or
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We had invited Judge Allen from Jasper, which was one of the emergency operating stops. I know NIM Kid stopped there. We had multiple counties there. He was invited to come. He wanted to come. He could not come. I talked to him as late as Friday. They still have a lot of trees down, and now they're into flooding there because of the recent rains, one on top of the other. But he did want me to pass on that their county mainly is co-ops. I've got a little bit of CenterPoint. I have a lot of energy and Entergy, and then I also have in my district, a lot of co-ops and stuff. And he said they actually did a very good job of getting in there. Sure, we lost power all over the place. It's a forest. It gets laid down. And but everybody's working pretty good to get in there. So I didn't really have any thing to add to that, except that he would be here, except for that one reason. Thank you.
Sarah Huffman?
Yes, thank you. And, I'd like to start out with a positive and certainly thank those who did such an excellent job during this disaster. I see Nim Kid over there. I mean, what a rock star. He just did a great job, so responsive to the needs of my constituents. Sometimes Tatum would make personal phone calls if I had a constituent who was really hurting, and I would make a request. They would call them personally. I think that's really should be commended. I see Matagorda County Judge Bobby Sieferman. As many of you know, Matagorda County was directly hit. The Sargent area was really devastated. And I think it's important that we note that our local officials did a great job across the board. As you talk about your county judge, Senator, really a great job, and we need to commend them. Commend Lieutenant Governor, who was so available as well. Acting Governor did a great job. But there are clearly some negatives, and I guess that's what we're here to explore. The infrastructure failures that many of my constituents had to suffer through, it can't be tolerated. I don't know the answers. I guess that's what we're here for, and I'm hoping that we don't answer here today, that your committee, Mr. Chairman, through Business and Commerce, will continue to ask those questions as we proceed through this session, see what we can do as a legislature, as a Senate, to make sure this doesn't happen again. So thank you very much, and thanks for everyone here who has an interest and for the senators participating today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Creighton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My light's not on, so I think my microphone works. You can hear me.
Yeah, they're not working today
Most
for
of
some
our
reason.
colleagues probably tired of hearing me over this past year, but it's great to see all of you and to be with you on the dais, working on behalf of our constituents. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your work leading in to calling this hearing, to the Lieutenant Governor for establishing the committee. Our sentiment in our opening remarks will be consistent. I'm sure we're looking for answers. Our constituents deserve answers. In particular, in my district, Maria Laredo, Judith Greet, J. Michael Taylor, and Richard Ross. Those are constituents of mine that are now deceased, that did not survive the storm. And it's important to me, with our local elected officials, our county judge, members of the Woodlands Township, and other community leaders that are here today to get answers. It's important that we work in every way possible today to have transparency and honesty with the 10th named storm since Hurricane Harvey, a storm of biblical proportions where we've spent countless time in these hearings and in this building working with our communities on resiliency and building forward, and all things under the guise and umbrella of preparation. How did we get to this point? So I'm eager today to find out what the answers are. I think we're going to hear some excuses that we need to work through with some surgery, and I look forward to being a part of that discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Colkhurst.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I echo what our members have been saying, and grateful to the Lieutenant Governor for his leadership during Hurricane Beryl. The preparation, we knew it was coming. It changed course. I had a feeling, having survived Harvey, Kid, that we know that those storms have a mind of their own. Like Senator Huffman, I think there are many unsung heroes during that storm. And Senator and Chairman, thank you for thanking the linemen who did their very best. I think the questions today we have to ask, were they staged properly? Were there enough of them? But I want to say to Senator Creighton, the names that you mentioned, plus 30 plus more, are no longer with us from a Category 1 hurricane. So the senator from the bullseye of Hurricane Harvey, a Category 4 versus a Category 1. A gentleman that owns restaurants in Harris County and Fort Bend County, he called me and he said, my goodness, Harvey was nothing compared to this. I don't understand how a Category 4 I could survive, get my restaurants up to serve people much more quickly than this storm. So I think the questions we have to ask are that. But I will just say that I know CenterPoint will be at the forefront. Judge Keogh, thank you for being here. I see a number of my constituents here. He will talk about the comparison in Montgomery County of Entergy versus CenterPoint and their responsiveness. So I'll end by saying this, that CenterPoint is a company that is granted and guaranteed a rate of return. In exchange for that privilege, the legislature and the public expects that decisions will be made responsibly to avoid long-term power disruption. The social contract between CenterPoint and the people it serves has been broken. What are we going to do about it? And I think that's what this committee is all about. So I thank you, and I look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Senator. Chair Bancourt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are times when you have to recognize the obvious. The obvious is we had a bunch of folks that did everything they could to mitigate problems that were in a very large service area. But the executive management at that company made major mistakes. And I'm talking mistakes over years that led us to a situation where we had 2.2 million users out of power for a period of time because we had a Cat 1 storm. Now, we're going to hear all sorts of comparisons to Ike. We're going to hear all sorts of comparisons to the fact that we have hurricanes here on the Gulf Coast. Well, let's recognize the obvious. We have hurricanes here on the Gulf Coast. Now, Florida decided to take this seriously about 20 years ago when they got plastered by about a half a dozen named storms. And you look at the trajectory that state went on, And I'm not talking about the response of the state of Texas, because I believe NIMKID and the OEM system that we have here is best in class in the country. I'm not talking about the county governments that are here, because I believe they did their job. I'm not talking about a lot of the other people we're going to see on this list of attendees, but I'm talking about one company that blew it. And your communication failures exasperated this and poured gasoline on the problem for millions of people to understand a simple question that we take for granted in this life is, are the lights on, and when are they going to come on, and are they going to stay on? Now, the problem is simple, because the communication was horrid by any measurement I understand. And more importantly, so many opportunities were missed years ago to fix this problem in advance. You know, KHOU 11 has got vegetation reports that you're half the per capita expenditure of your nearest competitor in service area. You know, they tracked multiple issues with line crews being basically idled for the better part of half a day, multiple days in a row. I don't get all this granularity because, like Senator King, I've got lots of questions about this generator contract, lots of them, because I think we've got 15 boat anchors, a very large problem to deal with that the ratepayers are paying for. So, Mr. Chairman, I submit to you, not this chairman, to you, that when you come up to stand, expect to be here a while, because I've got nearly my entire district was affected by this. I unfortunately don't have the names of my deceased, but I suspect they are higher in any Senate district that surrounds this area than just the three names that Senator Creighton. But more importantly, your duty to provide power to your service area, the folks no longer believe you can do it. And so it's not just the trust has been knocked down, it's been broken. And the more I read about what's happened, the more I read about when we could have deployed composite poles, when we could have deployed concrete poles, when we could have done a whole bunch of preventative work, just makes me madder and madder. And I can see why Lieutenant Governor convened this committee, Mr. Chairman, because this is long overdue. And what I just find astonishing and is aggravating to me, makes my blood boil, is the fact that we're having to have a hearing to hear about a whole bunch of people that did their job right, but the biggest multi-billion-dollar corporation, we're having to tell them how to do your job. And that is not something that I enjoy doing, but we're going to do it today because we have to. Because the people that died deserve an answer, the people that had their power off deserve an answer, and more importantly, the future of this region is based upon having access to power. And we're now getting, quite frankly, maybe not the reputation that I would like about that. I've got businesses, Mr. Chairman, that have all called me and said they are having to buy generators now. They can't afford 2 weeks of outages that they've had because it's not predictable to them. And in today's supply chain, you can't afford to be out if you're a small manufacturer. And you have a huge organization with tons of resources, and I'm not going to take this idea that you can't have a power tracker up because you weren't smart enough to get your stuff migrated to the cloud. Companies my size, 50 people, have done cloud migrations without disastrous failures of communication. And I'm sorry, I'm passionate about this, but this was maybe, to a large extent, avoidable. And that's really what I'm upset about. So I hope to hear from this.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Miles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to make it very clear, unlike some of my senior colleagues, I'm not happy to be here today. I repeat, I'm not happy to be here today because, colleagues, it seems like deja vu all over again. With a human error that could have been prevented, and we could have saved the most precious resources of Texas, which are human lives, Texans. And yes, I want to thank Lieutenant Governor. I want to thank NIMKID. I want to thank the state of Texas for the way they acted and rolled out. I want to thank all the hard workers that were out there for 4 days, a lot of them away from their families, 5 and 6 days away from their families. But Houston, like I said before, we've got a problem. And a problem that we shouldn't have to have. And a mistake in this magnitude costs lives. It cost us over 30 lives. So Senator Creighton, thank you for framing this meeting the way it should be framed. And it should be framed around human lives that were lost. And that's what we should be thinking of every time we ask the question. Because that's the most important resource that we can have in the state of Texas. So I'm looking forward to it, but I'm not happy to be here. And like my colleague, I too, Mr. Chairman, want to apologize now to you because I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions, straightforward questions that I want answers to. Okay? I was asked to be on this committee, so doggone it, I'm going to bring answers back home to my constituents. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to be forward and ask those questions. But I'm not happy to be here.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Alvarado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Lieutenant Governor for forming this committee. I know that we have a lot of unsung heroes, and I too wanted to thank TDM. We could call you in a minute's notice, and you'd have trucks load of ice and water for us to distribute. I think our office hosted or partnered with elected officials. We had about 12 distribution events throughout our district as late as the very last day that the last residents received their electricity. You know, what I'm afraid of is that we're getting into this situation of the haves and the have-nots. People who can afford to will buy their way out of this. People can go and buy generators. But we have people who can't afford generators, many of our constituents, and it should not be that that's the type of place that Houston, Harris County, or Texas is becoming, the haves and the have-nots. This cannot be the new normal. I think the formation of this committee underscores our commitment to improving for preparedness and response strategies to protect lives and livelihoods of Texans. I have gone through CenterPoint's response to the governor. There's a lot of gaps there, and I look forward to asking some very direct questions, and I hope that the CEO will provide in greater detail what happened, what your plan is moving forward. I saw a lot of dates and deadlines that y'all have given yourself, but there still is a lack of how you're going to get there, and just we need a deeper explanation of what your process is. I know we have folks from the IBEW here representing the linemen. These guys were working 16 hours. Some of them were didn't have places to stay. I heard stories about linemen that had to sleep in their vehicles a couple of nights, or they were staying in motels that didn't have electricity. We can't continue this way. We heard various media outlets that reported on linemen that had to wait hours and hours and hours. They'd get to the lot, the staging area, and then it would be 4 or more hours before they received an assignment to where to go. I hope you will be able to weigh in on that, because those were hours of work that people could have been getting their electricity put up. In May, when we had the derecho, your outage tracking system failed. I thought you would have learned from then that you would have corrected it. I was told by someone, well, y'all were negotiating or getting something done with a new software provider or something, and we're going to have it up and going during hurricane peak season. Hurricane peak season is now. The first day of hurricane season, you have to treat it as if it's the peak. Every day of hurricane season can be the peak. So I look forward to hearing your response. And I also want to thank my staff and all the other staff of elected officials' offices who rallied, who were out there in the heat, giving out water and ice. And I also want to thank our county officials. I know that we're going to be joined later by Mayor Whitmire, our former colleague. Certainly want to give kudos to him and the Houston City Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Middleton.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for putting this committee together with the Lieutenant Governor as well. I probably had 80 or 90% constituents that did not have power after this hurricane. And it is not a surprise that we're in hurricane season. And it is unbelievable that in the middle of hurricane season, they did not even have a functioning outage tracker with CenterPoint. And so many people were left literally in the dark, not just with their power, but with information. They didn't know what was next. They had no idea. I heard from county judges, heard from mayors, from people in the community, and we needed to know that, right? I mean, we have to understand the timelines of when this power is going to get restored, because there were hospitals calling me. And actually, one, we passed this mobile gen program. They had no idea it existed. I mean, that's pitiful. That is pitiful that they did not know that. And that is a total failure of communication on CenterPoint's point there. What's a nested outage? We're having to explain that to our constituents. Why are we having to explain that? They're calling me and saying my power's not on. And you have to tell them, well, I don't know, the lines show that they're charged, but no one on your street has power. What's the point of having an outage tracker if that's what the information you're giving us and giving our constituents in our community? And people lost their lives. And I'm glad so many of my colleagues brought that up. It's 30-something. I remember getting the call about a Galveston County elderly couple that died of heat exhaustion. I heard the other day, actually, someone had called in Baytown about a transformer that was leaning by the ground and was live. And they kept calling CenterPoint and saying someone's going to get killed, and guess what? They found a body underneath it. What happened? Why are we hearing stories like this? These are the things that are completely unacceptable. And people in our community deserve answers for them, and we need to make sure that we do better. And this doesn't happen again. Look, y'all are on the Gulf Coast, right? This is not like being in Central Texas. This is not like being in the Panhandle or East or West Texas. When you're the size that you are, you know that a common disaster can wipe the whole system out. So you have to be ready with your pre-staging. You have to be ready with your speed of deployment. You can't have an issue with field tickets where we're seeing all these pictures of linemen sitting in the parking lots. And that's not their fault. That's CenterPoint's leadership's fault. Our linemen are heroes in this, but they weren't given their field ticket orders in a way that matched the speed that they were ready to deploy. In other words, they were ready to go, but it was your fault that didn't happen. So, these are the things that we have to have answers to, and I'm worried because, look, we're in the middle of hurricane season still. We're still in the middle of hurricane season. It's only July. We've got at least two more bad months, and we still don't know exactly what y'all did and didn't do. And we've got to make sure that we fix this. And it really worries me. I'm truly concerned because this kind of failure and mismanagement and dropping the ball is something that can't happen on the Texas Gulf Coast. It can't. And thank God the community came together. Thank God for TDEM, our emergency operations managers, both with the cities and the counties, because they were there to help each other, right? They were providing hot meals. They were doing disaster feeding. They were getting ice to people. They're getting water to people. But they're having to do that because of you. And our communities are great at coming together. But they shouldn't have to go through that adversity. And now I'm hearing from small businesses saying, hey, July was supposed to be our best month. Now we're, all our profits gone for the whole year. And there could be some small businesses that go under as well because of y'all's failures. This is something that we're going to have to live with for a long time, unfortunately. So I'm looking forward to y'all answering questions today about how specifically you're going to do better and what concrete actions you're going to take to make sure that we don't ever have this happen again in hurricane season.
Thank you, Senator. Dean Zaffarini, I apologize for not calling on you in the proper order.
Oh, this is the proper order, Mr. Chairman, I assure you. Thank you so much for your courtesy, and I turned it on. And I certainly share the viewpoint of everyone who has talked. I've listened to all 11 speakers, and it's amazing that all of us can speak with one voice today. I'm sure that when Senator Lamantia speaks, we will note that all 13 of us are united. We're united in our gratitude to the Lieutenant Governor for appointing this committee, for TDEM, for the local governments, for the workers, for everyone who played a constructive role in this disaster. And we're also united in our concerns, united in our questions. I assure you that the questions you hear today from any member, might just as well have been asked by any other member who represents a district that was impacted, because it is so rare that 13 senators are able to look at a disaster or any other situation and be as united as you will see today. That is just amazing, and it is impressive. But we are so concerned, and equally important to our concern is the hope that we can do something about this, because we will look backward at who did what and why in the world we had such vegetation mitigation problems, what we must do going forward, what this legislature should do, and what this committee should recommend to the legislature that we do. For example, will we look beyond CenterPoint? Look not only at what CenterPoint did that was a failure and what must be done going forward, and how they will restore the trust and confidence not only of the people of Houston, but also the people statewide. For example, Mr. Chairman, as a CenterPoint customer in Laredo, I have to wonder, what if we had such a storm in Laredo? Would CenterPoint react exactly the same way, and would we have the same problems? So the eyes of Texas are upon CenterPoint, but really, this situation attracted worldwide attention, and they are now looking to us to solve the problem. What will we do going forward? Are we going to isolate CenterPoint, or look at CenterPoint as an example and then look at all other companies and all other providers of energy and say, these are the standards that you must meet going forward? Standards related to reliability, to resistance, and what will this legislature do about it? So I endorse the statements of my 11 colleagues so far, and I'm confident I will endorse those of Senator Lamantia. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for taking the time to give all 13 of us an opportunity to speak. That is highly unusual, too.
Thank you, Dean. Senator Lamantia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say thank you so much to the Lieutenant Governor also for putting together this committee and letting us sit on it. You know, at the very beginning when Hurricane Beryl was coming, we thought it was going to hit South Texas. And we saw TDM there, and we saw our counties come together, and everyone start preparing for it. But as the trajectory of the hurricane started moving up further north along the Gulf Coast, we saw how TDM and how our county governments pivoted and transitioned and started to prepare for it. And then once it hit Harris County, we were able to send our line workers up there to help, and our counties sent ambulances up to those areas to help. And so our local governments really came together. But we saw the failures in so many other ways. And I think the Dean made a great point in saying it's not just about reviewing what happened, but making sure this doesn't happen again, because we're just at the start of hurricane season. It's not if the next hurricane is going to hit, it's when and where. And we need to make sure that this doesn't happen, regardless of if we're dealing with CenterPoint or any other electric company and transition lines. And so this is not just about looking back and finding out what happened, but putting together those best practices so it doesn't happen anywhere else along any other community or again in Harris County, because we can't afford to have such losses and such loss of human life today when we know the next hurricane is coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Members, before you is the agenda. We will first hear from invited witnesses. I would ask that we allow those invited witnesses to get through their prepared remarks, as this is a large committee. And then we will allow members time to ask questions. I'm going to call up the witnesses in groups of 3 or 4. The reserved seats in the front are for any resource witnesses who are accompanying invited panelists and may need to be called upon during testimony. If you would, please quickly come up to the front seats when your agency or company is called. After we conclude invited testimony, we'll hear from members of the public. Those wishing to provide public testimony will be given 2 minutes per person. If you plan to testify, please register at the kiosk located outside the room. Of note, Mayor John Whitmire of Houston is at a funeral of a police officer and will be arriving this afternoon. And as soon as he arrives, we'll
Mr. Chairman, that police officer died
during the hurricane.
He is one of those 30-plus that lost his life. Thank you.
So, members, without further comment or question, we'll open up the floor and call the first panel. Chief Nim Kidd, Texas Division of Emergency Management, and then Commissioner Thomas Gleason, Chairman of the Public Utility Commission. Again, members, we've asked for some prepared remarks of some limited duration. We'll try to get through those remarks, and then we have a lot of questions for a lot of people. So we'll start with you, Mr. Kidd. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Chairman. My name is Nim Kidd, Chief of the Texas Division of Emergency Management, Vice Chancellor for Disaster and Emergency Services of the Texas A&M University System. I want to thank each of you sitting on the dais for your comments, but more importantly for your support. It was about 5 years ago that you pulled us out of the Department of Public Safety, Senator, as a division, and made us a standalone agency and nested us with the A&M University System. Chancellor Sharp, the Board of Regents, Vice Chancellor Jenny Jones there behind us in the back room, Blair Walsh from our team, really an incredible group of people. And I want to thank you all for your comments about me, but I am nothing without our team. And it's the men and women of TDIM that are on the street every day, 24 hours a day, most of the time impacted by the same disaster that they're responding to. Their families, their homes, their vehicles are also impacted. And it truly is a great team, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I'm starting my 15th year as Chief of the Division of Emergency Management here in the state of Texas. That's an experience of 22 presidentially declared disasters in that time, 7 emergency presidential disaster declarations, and Senator King's 75 fire management assistant grants in the last 14 years. Thanks to you being part of the A&M system, our funding that you have granted us with, blessed us with, is what makes us a great organization today. I think in total a little over $500 million over the last 3 bienniums, and that goes to our facilities and our fleet and our personnel that are out there able to do such a great job. We currently manage $22.5 billion in federal grant funds through our agency. Those are only going to continue to grow. Everything that our agency does is based in law and rule. Chapter 418 of the Texas Government Code is what sets the standard for how this state, the governor, the Division of Emergency Management, state finances, and our local governments are poised to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disaster declarations. It genuinely is a bottom-up approach. The citizens, Senator Miles, are our most important resource. Thank you for pointing that out. Our cities are the front line of defense in disaster preparedness and response. When you push those 3 magic buttons on your cell phone, it's usually not a state of Texas asset that shows up. It is a local government, police car, ambulance, or fire truck. We build from the cities that are supported by our county governments. Our counties are supported by disaster districts. The 24 councils of government, as outlined in Chapter 418, create disaster districts. At each of those district levels is a group of state agencies that are part of the Emergency Management Council, also authorized in Chapter 418 and designated by Governor Abbott's Executive Order GA-05, that at the district level are there to support requests from our cities and counties. We're not there to second-guess our local partners. We are there to support our local partners. Up from the district level is the regional level. We are divided into 8 regions across this state. That helps us with manageable spans of control as we dispatch resources to support local partners. And then the State Operations Center here in Austin. From the State Operations Center, our next level of support goes back to FEMA Region 6. Tony Robinson is our regional administrator. He lives and works out of Denton, Texas, and they do a great job at the FEMA field staff level of supporting our assets. And Chairman, if I may, I'm going to break a little bit from my traditional line of testimony. I'm actually going to try to read for you a little bit today. Because because I think this is so important that we talk about the timings. And I want you to know that 12 days before landfall, the Division of Emergency Management and our meteorologists were paying attention to this storm. On June the 26th, our meteorologists began briefing the State Operations Center command team about an area of disturbed weather in the main development region of the tropical Atlantic, and had a medium range, at that time 12 days out, 40 to 60% chance of development over the next 7 days. This is an indicator and a trigger for our team. This is what we start sharing at the state level all the way down through our system to our local government partners. The next day, 11 days before landfall, the National Hurricane Center had upped the chance of development for the area of low pressure to high, which is 80% chance of development over the next 7 days, and our meteorologists within TDIM started working on daily coordination conference calls. On Friday, June the 28th, 10 days before landfall, the National Hurricane Center at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon noted the area of low pressure had a high chance of tropical development. At this time, the TDM meteorologist warned that all interest in the state of Texas should monitor the system in the upcoming days. Later that night, the system became known as Tropical Depression Number 2. On Saturday, June the 29th, 9 days before the storm, TD2 was upgraded to Tropical Storm Beryl. TD meteorologist updated SOC command staff by strengthening the system and making sure that all of our resources would be in place, and over the next 24 hours, Beryl could become a major hurricane. Saturday, June 29th, 8 days out, the TD meteorologists continue to track Beryl with strengthening into a major hurricane, and as we watch this move across the Yucatan. 1 week before this storm made landfall in Texas, we began our mandated coordination conference calls with our local governments. And even though the track of that storm then was going into Mexico, Senator Lamantilla, we were worried that it could have shifted a little bit to the north because, you know, there's so many people that look at the National Hurricane Center and they see the forecast maps and they see the cone of uncertainty. What a horrible name, right? It's even more horrible when you realize that 30% of the time, the storm will make landfall outside of that cone of uncertainty. This is why we in Texas, anytime anything enters the Gulf, we're paying attention. We're focusing resources on it. We're making sure that our local partners are engaged and that our state agencies are ready. This particular storm didn't pay attention to holidays either. And I think that was one of our biggest concerns, that right in the middle of the week was 4th of July. And with so many people with a 4-day weekend, so many people down visiting the beach, you know, enjoying the great sunshine and the great weather, may not be paying attention to their social media feeds or the news broadcast. So this is why we do our best to make sure that we make positive contact with all of our elected officials. Every county judge gets a text message from me asking, hey, checking in, how you doing? Sometimes it's before they even realize what I'm asking for. And I'm always grateful for their responses because it truly is a teamwork approach. I'll continue with my reading here on July 4th. Beryl weakened slightly, but still a major hurricane. Our meteorologists were telling us the potential for increasing to a major flood-producing storm could be happening. On Friday, the July 5th, Beryl moving into the Yucatan Peninsula with many forecasts showing a Texas landfall. So we're about 3 days out. And, you know, I want to thank the National Hurricane Center. They do a really good job of forecasting mathematical models on very unpredictable storms. And they've gone from a 7 to a 10-day forecast. But I think, Chairman, that leads us to a false sense of security. Because when they start pointing that map in the cone of uncertainty of where it's going, those that fall outside of that cone think they have nothing to worry about. And that's just not true. We saw with this storm heading down into deep Mexico, 80 miles south of Brownsville, and winding up within really 72 hours time frame, moving around and going in to Matagorda County. We had resources before landfall from Brownsville to Alice to San Antonio to College Station and into Houston, even when this storm was predicted to hit south of the Texas border. Because we've learned from so many disasters that the storms do not pay attention to the forecast. And our job is to have assets and resources everywhere our local government partners may need them. I want to talk a little bit about the major disaster declaration, and I'm very appreciative of Governor Patrick and the work that he did, the time that he spent with us in the State Emergency Operations Center, this time that he spent traveling with us. It was a great experience for me. I want to talk about, Chairman, your appointment of the Texas Energy Reliability Council, TERC. And so with TERC, we have started energy industry coordination calls to make sure that our oil and gas partners, as well as our electric partners, are in sync for every disaster. We held 11 calls with the Energy Industry Coordination Group to focus on Beryl to make sure that resources were there to keep the lights on in Texas. Those calls were at 2 o'clock every day. We distributed, to support of our local government partners, about a little over 7.8 million bottles of water, over 960,000 meals ready to eat. That does not count our VOADs, our volunteer organizations active in disaster, that were out there serving hot meals to all of the citizens. That doesn't count that number. This is just the boxes that we handed out. And 316,000 bags of ice. We marshaled over 2,500 state and local government partners from outside of the local areas, outside of our local 911 systems, to be able to support this event. While we like to say major hurricanes are Category 3 or greater, I will tell you this was a major hurricane. This was a major storm. And the state agencies and the resources that came together to support our local government partners are second to none. But Chairman, we cannot forget that our mayors and county judges and their emergency management teams and first responders are on the front line. and we do everything we can to support them through these processes. I've said a lot. I want to talk about our resource staging areas, and Senator King, I know you talked about the firefighting aircraft that are available. You know, during the wildfires, we had over 50 aircraft that were supported by the feds. Today in Texas, I have 2, because the rest of them are fighting fire out on the West Coast right now. And so we're going to talk about what we need for hurricanes, but we need to remember we are not a hurricane-only state. And Chairman, with that, I'll pause for any questions.
Thank you. Senator Huffman.
Just a brief question, and I'm sort of looking ahead because I know some questions we're going to have about these generators. So I want to ask you a question. You talked about, since you're so experienced, you're the perfect person to ask, that you have participated in, 22 declared disasters, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Am I correct that when there is a declared disaster, that if there's a need, the governor has the ability to waive many laws, many rules and regulations, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And I read somewhere, in maybe the news reports or some of the materials prepared for me, that CenterPoint stated that these large generators, that one of the issues about getting them was that it took so long to get a permit to move them, correct? Do you remember hearing them say that?
I have not heard that, but it would not surprise me, no, ma'am.
All right. When in reality, that a call probably to the governor from pretty much anyone on this dais, certainly you, would be answered almost immediately during a declared disaster, correct?
That's correct, Senator.
And in your opinion, is that the kind of regulation that the governor would sign off on?
Yes, ma'am.
Immediately?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. That's my only question.
And Senator, I believe that happened in this storm early on, even before landfall.
Oh, it did. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Chief, you lay out articulate a very clear picture of the state's preparedness and how we as a state work with the local cities and counties in preparing for contingencies of any sort of storm or disaster that we can foresee, in this case a hurricane. How do we work with regulated industries regarding making sure they're prepared, making sure they are taking it as seriously? What was the communication between TDM and CenterPoint and some of the municipal-owned utilities, energy during the storm? People want to know that as well.
Yes, sir. And I'm going to reference back to Governor Abbott's Executive Order GA05, and that sets the Texas Emergency Management Council. There are 39 agencies on that council. Public Utility Commission is on that council. The Railroad Commission is on that council. Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, or some of the more prevalent regulatory bodies, Health and Human Services Commission, State Health Services, DPS, Military Department. I'll send the list. They set with us, these regulatory agencies, the Emergency Management Council, like the Public Utility Commission, are embedded in the State Emergency Operations Center. They're with us all the way around the clock, and they send information out to their regulated bodies. Also, all of those regulated bodies are invited to join our daily weather calls. So that message of what we're doing, when we're doing, and how we're doing it is broadcast to the agencies on the council and then disseminated back out through their interest.
And to be clear, the PUC regulates electricity in the state of Texas, and their preparedness of each individual company, the co-ops, municipalities, is based upon emergency operation plans that are at the PUC that should have been followed and respected in conjunction with the seriousness for which the state was preparing.
Yes, sir.
Okay. How many counties did we help out and talk to and declare as emergency disaster areas?
Yes, over 121 counties were in the state disaster declaration. 67 of those counties are in the federal disaster declaration. I can tell you out of the 121 counties, we had resources staged, ready to support any of those that were impacted. And those were all pre-landfall. The reason that we picked those counties is because that's where our meteorologists, and I don't think I've explained this very well, we use 3 different sources of information for our weather. There's a joke in there, but I'll leave the joke because it's a serious conversation. But the National Weather Service has 13 offices in Texas. They have 13 independent weather offices in Texas that are coordinated through something called the Southern Region Headquarters, the Southern Region ROC, and it's in Fort Worth. Those 13 offices talk directly to our cities and counties at the local government level. On our statewide calls, those get aggregated back up on the National Weather Service side to the Southern Region ROC that talks about a statewide forecast. I mean, with 13 members here, you know, you can imagine each one having their own decision, their own chief meteorologist, their own forecast. But how do we make sure that each one of them are touching the others in our cities and counties that fall under those boundaries, if you will? So by coordinating those calls together, we get what the public sees as a forecast. I use two other sources of information beyond that to make our decisions. One is a private, for-profit organization that does pure meteorology. All they do is tell us what the science says. All they do is give us a forecast that is distilled down so that I can read it and understand it, and it gives their best estimate of what they think it's going to do. And then finally, thanks to your support, we have embedded real professional meteorologists that work at the Division of Emergency Management. And their job is to look at what the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center is telling the public, what our science providers are telling us, and discern the differences between the two and make sure that we're not just looking at the most likely scenario, but we're in fact preparing for the worst case scenario. You asked how many counties did we help? And we started helping counties in South Texas when this thing was well going down into Mexico. And the reason, because the north or the east side of the storm is usually the dirty side. So no matter where landfall makes, with a 50 to 100 mile radius of tropical storm force or worse winds, we would see damages in deep South Texas. And so making sure that local governments that support us through our Emergency Medical Task Force and TIFMAS program have gathered resources as moved down to the valley. I mean, I'm trying to find somebody that'll make an animated map for me, because we're tracking all the GPS pieces of where these vehicles are. So you can see by date and time, as forecast comes in, how they start moving in and up and around to be surrounded. To answer the question, how many did we help? All of them that asked and some that didn't is the answer.
Regarding the electricity, that information regarding forecasts is available on a daily basis to the municipal-owned utilities, all the electric generation facilities and providers, transmission distribution companies, the co-ops. They can utilize that type of forecasting assistance in conjunction with whatever internal processes they have.
Yes, sir. On our daily calls, we post and publish and try to expand the awareness of the National Hurricane Center's forecast every day. In quiet conversations with those folks after that, we also share what our worst case scenario will be.
Questions, members of Mr. Kidd, of Senator Miles?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Chief Kidd, real quick question, because I want to make it very clear for my people back home, because they're watching, they want a clear understanding. They may not know what PUC is, okay? So I'm going to ask you this question, if you can just give me yes or no answers in the beginning, and then you'll see where I'm going with this. There was knowledge of Hurricane Beryl before it hit, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I heard you say you gave it to PUC. You shared it with the utility companies. But did you specifically share this with and notify Texas New Mexico Power specifically? Or did you go through PUC to notify them?
Senator, we went through both, okay. And I can provide your office and the rest a list of the email addresses of those that received our notification.
So for a simple question, did you notify Texas New Mexico Power? Did you notify them? Did your department and your team notify them?
I cannot say yes to that.
Okay. How about American Electrical Power?
I cannot say yes to that.
Okay. And CenterPoint?
Yes.
You did notify CenterPoint?
Yes, sir.
So your office and your team did notify CenterPoint that Beryl was coming?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And Senator, I would like to say, I believe we notified those others as well. I just don't want to.
Sure, you notified CenterPoint?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay. And can you explain to the people back home and to my colleagues, when you say you notify them, what does that process look like? What do you tell them? Give them the information that you give to them.
It's an email invitation to the statewide coordination call so they can get the same information that all of our state agencies and local government partners get.
And that's
they're
that
a seat right
information.
there at the table with us.
Can you give me a brief breakdown or
Yes, sir.
what that information entails?
Sure, happy to. So every one of our calls starts off with the latest forecast. You know, the Hurricane Center updates its forecast about 4 times in a 24-hour period. Some of our partners do it a little more than that. They take these massive models or mathematical calculations to develop that forecast. The beginning of every one of our calls starts off with the latest weather, track of the storm, intensity of the storm, and what we expect the impacts to be. Then we go through our Emergency Management Council by emergency support function, transportation impacts, communication impacts, water and wastewater impacts, utility impacts, telephone impacts. We talk about from each of the council agencies what they believe damages could be and resources are available. And then we turn it back over to our regions on that statewide call. The calls before that are cities and counties reporting up as well.
And real quick, how do you know that you notified? How do you know that you notified CenterPoint?
2 ways.
2 ways.
One is, and I'll let Chairman Gleason speak on the public utility side, but from the State Emergency Operations Center email that goes out to members of TERC, the Texas Energy Reliability Council, of which CenterPoint has members on that council. They have employees on that council. And then we have additional email addresses that are at CenterPoint for those notifications to go to.
So for the people back home that call my office multiple times asking me, did the state not notify CenterPoint? Did the state not notify CenterPoint? The simple answer is,
we notified CenterPoint.
we notified CenterPoint. Thank you. And I have one other question for this testifying witness. And this is probably something my Fort Bend people have been asking as well. Do you have any idea why it took so long for Fort Bend County to receive its FEMA approval individual federal aid package?
Senator, I
You
think
understand you know where I'm going with that
yes, sir.
one?
Your question is about individual assistance, the IA program. Contrary to what some of the media has been reporting recently about how fast the federal government may work to disaster response, there still is a process that the feds must follow that involves doing damage assessments for both public assistance, which is not what you're asking about,
Right.
but individual assistance, which is what you are asking about. 2 things need to happen in individual assistance. Either the city or the county does a disaster summary outline and submits that to us. We aggregate that data and submit it to FEMA. Or we've been pushing a tool called ISTAT, the Individual Assistance State of Texas Assessment Tool, where homeowners can take, if they have electricity to charge their cell phone, if their cell phones are working, they can take a picture of their house or their property and fill out a form online, and that counts towards our federal assessment. So also to set and manage expectations. The federal government gives all states 30 days from the time of the disaster to get their damage assessments in. Now, 30 days is a long time when you're waiting on an answer. We don't wait 30 days. But I can tell you, historically, going back to data from 2007, it takes the federal government 16 days to answer a governor's request.
Gotcha. Well, let me say once again, thank you for the hard work that you and your team put in.
Thanks.
You're always there for us. You've always answered my phone calls. And my constituents, thank you.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chief Kidd, you said there were 39 different state agencies that are part of the council, of which PUC is one of those.
Yes, sir.
And I want to get to kind of the heart of, well, I think a lot of constituents, ratepayers, citizens, or the state is being proactive. We're preparing. We have meteorologists. We have pre-positioning. But we also have partners, regulated utilities in this case, that are overseen by the Public Utility Commission in the case of CenterPoint. How do we, besides just notifying them, going to Senator Miles' point, how do we make sure that they are also preparing and living up to what we as a state have entrusted them to do, in this case, have essentially a monopoly of supplying, transmitting, and distributing electricity in a certain area with some amount of reliability and resiliency into the system. How do we make sure our partners are doing their job? And Chairman Gleason, in this case, I want you to answer that, because this has to go to the heart of the matter of CenterPoint, their failure as a private entity, for-profit entity, that we as a state have entrusted them to be a regulated monopoly in the greater Houston area.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman. Members, for the record, Thomas Gleason, Chairman, Public Utility Commission of Texas. And I'll skip over all my prepared remarks and just respond to some of the questions. So to your question about how we ensure this, so the first thing we do to the question about notification, as soon as TDM, tells us that they're going to activate the State Operations Center, we reach out to those utilities. We had the affected utilities at the State Operations Center with us so that the information could flow from them to TDM, to the local partners, and the other way.
CenterPoint was there?
CenterPoint was there, TNMP was there, Entergy was there, and a representative from the Co-op Association was also there.
Okay.
Our role as the economic regulator of CenterPoint is to look at the economic incentives and make sure that they're aligned with what the public expects, what you all expect, the governor expects. So I think our role in this comes that obviously if a utility is not investing what they should in their infrastructure and their resilience to provide reliable electricity, we have to look at those incentives and where we can in rule, make changes, where we can in statute, come to you all with ideas, working in coordination with the House and the Senate, to make sure that we have the ability to align those incentives. For, in this case, I would say, are they spending enough money on vegetation management? Is an easy one to really look at and say, if you look at per line mile, how much they're spending compared to, say, an Encore, is that sufficient for them to ensure that they can provide reliable service? One thing that I think is really important at the State Operations Center that goes to the question that Senator Huffman asked is I think one of the best things that NIM's team does at the end whenever any agency or private partner is reporting on what they're doing, they end every call with, are there any unmet resource requests? That's extremely important because his Division of Emergency Management is the best way to ensure that any resource needs can be met at the local level where the utility is out there. To my knowledge, I wasn't on all 11 calls. I did not hear any resource requests that were unmet at the time. I would say to Senator Miles, as far as notification and where we heard, I will tell you when it looked like the storm was going to hit the AEP territory, the CEO of AEP reached out to me. As soon as we knew that there was going to be an activation, that CEO reached out to me, asked if there was anything I could do, told me what they were planning to do. I did not get a similar call from CenterPoint, so I can say that. Mr. Chairman, just for my prepared remarks, I think the only thing I would hit on is consistent with the governor's directive to me in a letter, we have opened an investigation to look into this, to look into pre-storm preparation, what the activities were for all these utilities during the storm, and then post-event activities. One thing that'll be different from a typical investigation enforcement action in this case is we will not be handling this like a contested case where the outcome is some administrative penalty that goes to general revenue. What I told the governor, what I've told the lieutenant governor is I think the best way for this investigation to move forward is to be in the light of day. So everyone can see what's going on. They can all have the same information that we would get in an investigation. So right now we're working on RFIs. I've asked our staff to reach out to the House, to the Senate, and to local leadership to decide what questions really need to be asked. And I think the local part is really important because those officials are on the ground with those constituents every day. And so we're working on our first set of RFIs. Those will go out. The responses will be public. So I want to stress that. Everything we do in this investigation will be public. Mr. Chairman, I have some other things that I had in my prepared remarks, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
And we just touched base, there's the resiliency plans that the PUC is reviewing at different levels for the 4 different regulated transmission distribution companies. CenterPoint's is pretty massive. It's $2.2 billion. And this is new legislation, members, that we passed that allows transmission distribution companies to avail themselves of a new process to make their distribution system more resilient. And I was just reading, and I know that's been pulled down and abated currently, according to action y'all took several days ago. But it surprises me looking at the docket, the action y'all took, or they took, that targeted critical circuit vegetation management is incremental OEM operations and management. So it's $25 million over a 3-year period. But wildfire mitigation projects, incremental OEM is 43.7, which is not quite double, but significantly more. And so it goes back to, what's a bigger threat and a bigger area. We certainly have seen a lot of vegetation issues in the greater Houston area, but these are things that raise my eye about how we're going to be allowing, as a state, through the PUC, more revenue going to companies utilized for what services that make their grid more reliable. Do you have and resilient? Do you have any comment on the concerns of the resiliency plans, in particular the one that's been proposed by CenterPoint and now abated?
So, yes, Senator, so I can't get into the specifics. That's a contested case, so I can't speak in this venue on the specifics of their plan. Yes, it is abated. That was done. All the participants in that case asked for it to be abated, including the city of Houston. Mayor Whitmire sent a letter asking for it to be abated. When CenterPoint came up at our last open meeting last Thursday, the reason they're doing that is because I think they don't believe that what they submitted was sufficient to address all of these issues. And so I think it's prudent and appropriate for them to pull that down, to continue to talk to the other stakeholders, and to make sure that what they submit to us meets everyone's desire to have a more reliable, resilient system. And that's my hope, that through this abatement process, we can get there.
Vice Chair King and other members, I'm sure, have plenty of questions.
Just a quick one. Are all vegetation costs currently recoverable?
Yes.
Okay,
So-
even without a resiliency plan,
Yes.
if a utility submits costs to you for vegetation, that's a common thing you've been dealing with since the beginning of electric power.
Yes, that's part of their O&M costs they earn recovery of, but not a return on those costs. And I will say, yeah, as long as those are prudently incurred, they can recover those in rates.
Okay, thank you.
Questions?
Thank you. I just had a quick question, follow up on Senator Miles's question to TDM. The ISTAT issue with the individuals having to do, is that new? Because I don't recall that being done before.
Yes, ma'am. In the post-COVID world, FEMA couldn't marshal enough staff to go out and do walk in the street and eyes-on investigations. So we at the state level developed this tool so that our citizens could enter the information directly.
Okay, thank you.
Sir Bancourt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. By Friday, okay, because I think that's an important day of the holiday week, and you had determined by that point in time, by your forecasting, that this was nearly 100% likely landfall for Texas at that point, and that we were hoping that it wouldn't turn into a major, by hurricane definition, Category 3, 4, and 5. There was still some possibility of a 2, but fortunately, it was ingesting dry air, and we had, we maintained a minimal, not quite minimal, but 80 mile per hour. So explain where we were at on that Friday, because I think this is important.
So that Friday, the State Operations Center completely up and running and staffed, resources in the field, boat squads to do water rescue, TxDOT on scene to help clear out roads and drainage, military department high-profile vehicles, A&M Forest Service ready to do tree trimming and debris removal, A&M search and rescue teams for swift water rescue, and then several aircraft helicopter capability completely surrounding the potentially impacted area.
Right, so I believe by this point in time, the general, I know that on a radio program I use Space City Weather. We were looking at probable Matagorda Bay by that point in time.
Yes, sir.
So by that point in time, because you're notifying everyone, there was a nearly 100% likelihood of a Texas landfall. We had a pretty good idea that it was headed east, riding around the high pressure system. And that would, in fact, should have been very obvious to CenterPoint and really all the parties involved, true?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, Mr. Gleason had referenced that he hadn't gotten a phone call from anybody at CenterPoint. Did you get a call from somebody at CenterPoint?
I know we had a rep in the Emergency Operations Center. I don't remember phone calls going back and
I mean,
forth.
anything from an executive management level?
No, sir.
Mr. Gleason, from you?
So just to clarify, I did not hear from the CenterPoint CEO. We did hear from their regulatory folks once it looked like the storm was going to head further north and further east.
but anybody that was theoretically the CEO, I'm not even sure they have a COO, anybody in operations, non-regulatory, non-finance, you have not heard from any of these people?
No, sir, I did not. Not in advance of the storm.
Mr. Kim, neither? Okay. Now, we've talked briefly about the fact that there's clearly a vegetation management component to this, that if, and I'm relying on reports from Channel 11, actually, because they were doing that publicly. It looked like vegetation management numbers on a per capita base, I'm not sure on a per mile base, but were approximately double in a service provider to the north of CenterPoint on a yearly basis. True?
That is true. I think when I saw it on a per mile basis, it was also significantly less. One of the things in our investigation project that I've asked staff to put in there are numbers for spend on vegetation management from 2013 all the way through 2023 so that people can see that comparison.
Right, because I think because vegetation management just doesn't occur overnight, even in a storm cleanup. But this is a compounded issue over years. True? Now, and because if you have a low vegetation expense, and I'm trying to explain this clearly for the public that's listening, it means you're not clearing the lines as well as maybe your other service providers in the area are doing, and therefore you have a higher risk of power outages and more lengthy power outages. Is that common wisdom?
So yes, I would say there is definitely a correlation on spend. I would say even more important, though, is how often they're going out and surveying their entire system and looking at what actually needs to be done. You know, we went, the morning I was in Houston for one of the press conferences, I actually went out with CenterPoint to look at some of the damage. And what I was really shocked by, Senator, was how small on the distribution side some of their right-of-way is. We were in Bel Air, I believe, and I would say the span of their right-of-way on either side of the distribution line was maybe 18 inches. And these homes, these properties had 25, 30-foot hedges and trees, you know, basically 18 inches away from those lines. And so one of the things that I've spoken to CenterPoint about is how do we address that issue? Because yes, they need to manage their own right-of-way where they have authority to cut those trees down. But an issue as well is the private property owners letting CenterPoint and other TDUs get on their property and potentially take down those trees that could be hazardous to reliability.
Right, because what you're saying, that's a 3-foot wide easement. That's not even a 10-foot wide easement.
That's correct. And it was so difficult and it was so close that crews were having an almost impossible time just getting to the line and to the poles to actually make repairs.
And I think your point about surveying is important because after Harvey, my wife, should I say, got my attention. And so I got my CenterPoint contact's attention. And there was a significant uptick in surveying and action in West Memorial and west side of Houston for a few years. Unfortunately, that activity dropped off. So I would really be interested in seeing these multi-year comparisons. Now, we've talked about where obviously there was an under expense. We do need to talk about what clearly is an over expense. And so, you know where I'm going, okay? The mobile generation is clearly an issue because this is $800 million that if you lease something is at least $1.2 billion, okay? If all my published reports are correct, there's approximately 15 of those mobile generators are 32 megawatt, which is literally it's an Army convoy transport problem. It's literally 3 major semis. And I think Senator Huffman made a good point. You can get a permit in this type of problem like that, but you still have to move it and hook it up. So there seems to be, that was an awfully high expenditure compared to anyone else. Is that true, Mr. Gleason?
That is true. It was significantly more than, say, Encore asked for in their case for mobile generation.
Now, some of the questions I tend to ask Chairman Wells is I'm reading directly from contested issues from a filing here. The bid that was accepted, which was Life Cycle, okay, had a competitor. And a competitor named DPS lease for the large generators was 44% lower than LCP's bid. And for smaller generators, the lease was 60% lower. So this expenditure was quite high by even a competitive bid standpoint. Do we have the actual numbers of what these bids are yet?
So that was done. I can get those to you. I don't have them in front of me, but we can provide that to the committee.
But that's a huge differential in cost, okay? All right, well, Senator Huffman may have them.
I happen to have them.
Well, good.
Ask for them.
Would you
Senator
like
Huffman,
to
we want to share with
read
the
those? And I will yield, but get the balance of my time back, even though
I'll
we
just-
don't do that this way.
I have so there's two different, the smaller units are ERS, Energy Rental Solutions. The larger are Life Cycle Power, LCP. And the larger are until September 2029, which is the expiration of your 2021 bill or whoever's bill that was. So the ERS 1 kilowatt is $22,000 a month. The 500 kilowatt is $12,000 a month. The 400 kilowatt is $21,000 a month. The 200 to 230 kilowatt is $15,000 a month. The 5.5 megawatt is $111,000 a month. The 31 to 32 megawatt is $490,000 a month. And the 32 and a half, 35 megawatt is $490,000 a month.
Who's paying for that?
Well, to answer Senator Colcourt's rhetorical question, who's paying for it? My ratepayers are paying for it, and everybody in Senator Miles' district's paying for it, and everybody in Senator Alvarado's district
Don't forget
paying
my
for it.
district.
I know, I'm coming back to.
Thank you.
Then, and the chairman can, and the finance chairman, Senator Huffman, can add up all the numbers on this, along with Senator Mays and Middleton. Everybody's paying for this. Now, let's talk about how this decision got made. So let's take those very high numbers, okay, and knock them down by 44% for the larger units and 60% for the smaller. You're roughly close to about 50% overpay. Am I missing something? If this other bid had been accepted. Now, I want to point out that I know the PUC approved this. I do know that an administrative judge sided against this. I know the commission did it, but I also am astonished that any company would present a bid that was 50% larger than a competitive bid owned by a Fortune 500 company, and yet went with a smaller company for reasons that I would love to hear why. Okay, so this $800 million could have been substantially less, even if we were to have authorized this, because you've got effectively 15 blackout generators and not something that could be used in the type of hurricane damage we're looking at right now. Please.
Yes, sir. So Senator Betancourt, you're absolutely correct. During the contested case proceeding, the proposal for decision came back from the ALJ recommending the commission not approve this in that amount. I believe and subject to check, I believe most of the parties other than CenterPoint agreed with that. The commissioners at that time did approve for all of that to go into rate base. The only thing I would say for context around right sizing of which units at what time to actually procure or lease is, coming out of Winter Storm Uri, I think there was a desire to make sure to protect against that, and these larger units will help during a Winter Storm Uri type event. But I think it is fair to question, given how often a Uri is expected to happen, say once in 100 years, versus a distribution level event like what we saw here with a hurricane, I think it is fair to question why they needed so many of these for something that isn't going to happen very often.
Well, I've got some suggestions for Chairman Wells when he comes up what to do with these units, but specifically, you've touched on a really important point. If you've got a winter storm, let's say it's 1 out of 100 years, maybe it's 1 out of 33, 50, we have no idea what it really is. The life cycle of this equipment will already have expired. Now, here's the problem. My ratepayers are probably already paying at $1 per month more because of this. It's apparently going to be, Senator Alvarado, $3 a month more by the time we get through this. Now, I assume that there's actually some ownership now by this point in time after several years. They may have flipped from lease to own. But instead of spending the money on vegetation management, which fixes the problem, we spent a bunch of money. And I mean, this is an enormous amount of money. This is $1.2 billion on generation, which 80% of it can't be used in a hurricane recovery mode. Am I missing something, Mr. Gleason?
No, sir, you're not. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think it goes to my comments about incentives. There's an incentive. So what the commission authorizes is an opportunity to earn a certain return. And there are definitely incentives if that return is lower than what is authorized to move spend from O&M, like vegetation management, into plan and service so that there can be not only a recovery of those expenditures, but a return on those expenditures. And so I think that's one of the things my rate staff and others are going to look into. Other places around the nation that maybe look at that differently. I know Florida was mentioned, how they went about ensuring that those companies in Florida, Florida Power and Light, put in the required infrastructure, but also did the right O&M to make sure that the system was reliable.
Right, because FPL also started putting in concrete poles, years ago, composite poles en masse in the last year or two. And no offense, this is a solution that is low-hanging fruit, that is rotting on the ground, being able to pick up and apply to a Gulf Coast utility. Mr. Chairman, it's sitting, the solution is there, and Florida is deploying it.
And I would say similar to what we did after Uri on the weatherization side, there's probably not a one-size-fits-all for all of Texas. It's very different. What works for a coastal utility may not be what we need. So I think that's one of the other things we have to look at is how regionally we need to address this issue, because what works for an Encore may not work for an AEP or a CenterPoint.
Now, let me try, Mr. Chairman, let me try to put my best mattress Mac on this, explain this to the public. Basically, what happens is that vegetation management expense, you don't get, the utility doesn't make a profit on, right?
That's correct.
All right. However, they make a profit on generator expense. True or false?
Correct.
So the incentive is to not, if you don't make a profit on vegetation management, you may reduce those numbers, because if you maximize your generator expense through a company, which, by the way, the CEO of it has a felony. This is a very fascinating environment that we're in, okay? You maximize that expense, okay? Then there's a profit recovery on that expense. True or false?
That's correct.
Now, to quote my friend Mattress Mac, he would call that Bass Act words, and that's what it is. Now, I'm worried that a contract like this, it's more than Bass Act words. I'm going to expect, Mr. Chairman, when you come up, that we have all these numbers, that we know exactly why you picked this LCP operation, because if this was, if I was an inspector general, I'd be looking at this contract for fraud, because it is fraudulent for the taxpayers of this state through ratepayers, which is effectively the same thing, to pay for generators that have markups over a bid of 44 to 60% more than their competitors. And then how much is the profit margin on that, Mr. Gleason?
So they have an authorized rate of return of somewhere in the 9 to 10, less than 10.
Let's call it 9.5% for fun, okay? This is unconscionable. We have spent the money, and the taxpayer and the ratepayers are paying in the wrong place to solve a problem that may not happen for quite some time. And this has taken years to come out, but it only comes out after two storms force it out into the public. And I see no proactive action by anybody in executive management at CenterPoint to do anything about this.
And Senator, the only other context I would add is you're correct in your statement. Initially, these mobile generation facilities had to be leased. Change was made to allow them to own it, and I think the companies made the case that it is over the life of that unit less expensive. But I think it's important to point out the point what you made is if you have a lease, eventually that lease runs out.
Sure.
If you're buying these units and you have them for, 20 years, but you're using them for a once in 50-year storm, once 100-year storm, those type of assets may be more prudent to lease than buy. And that's another thing we'll be looking into, kind of how they have diversified all the utilities that have mobile gen, what they lease versus what they procure.
Right, but by any measurement I understand, CenterPoint plunged into this with 500 megawatts, and the nearest other person was 11.
Yes, much less.
This is, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, members, it's a big problem because we've got basically these boat anchors strapped around our ratepayers for a long period of time. And unfortunately, in a high inflationary era, this is not a welcome thing because we're probably going to have to increase vegetation management costs. And boy, we could have used this cut. And I'm actually thinking about trying to come up with some legislation that would able to claw back some of this expense. Because quite frankly, when I see a bid that's marked up by 50%, and you guys get to put 9.5%, 10% profit on it, I want to claw that back because that's, to me, that's fraud. We have defrauded the ratepayers of CenterPoint by this money. Because even if we thought it was a legitimate expense, we clearly had a lower bid that was dramatically lower. And now they have to pay for it when they really need to be paying for vegetation management. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Some very good points. One question, I know there's lots of other members. During the storm, private industries, private companies, such as CenterPoint, do they have any real-time communication regarding how much activation through their emergency operation plans and tabletop exercises that for this storm in particular, do they relay that information to the PUC or to state operations in any effect?
Yes, so they should be putting in place, they have emergency operations plans on file with us. I believe they're required to drill those emergency operations plans annually, and they file a letter with us saying, yes, we drilled this emergency operations plan and it was successful. And then we have the idea is that's what they would go to as a game plan when a storm hits or a Uri type event, so that they are not in real time trying to figure out how to respond.
And this tabletop exercise, I believe, was done in April for CenterPoint.
I believe that's correct.
And it was for a Category 3 storm or 4 storm, if I'm advised correctly.
That's correct as well.
But yet, what we saw with the Category 1 storm with high winds was more of a failure than I assume the tabletop. There's some questions there regarding what they use for their exercise. But during the storm, do they relay back, hey, we've called upon 2,500 mutual assistance crews from XYZ? Do they give you a list or any sort of information regarding what they are doing to assure the state through y'all, the division chief and the chairman of the PUC, that they're taking it with the same amount of seriousness the state of Texas is?
Yes, sir. So they relay that information on the calls. The TDM coordinates, as well as I would say at least twice a day in the morning and at night, emails from their staff to us, and I believe that same communication goes out to the legislature.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Lois, and then
Sure.
I'm sorry, Senator Colker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Bencourt, for that deep dive. I'm going to kind of pull out just a little bit, and I'm going to ask Chairman Gleason a couple of questions. For my constituents who live in an area, I have constituents served by MOUs, municipally owned utilities, and some by cooperatives, some by investor-owned utilities. It's really interesting to me that, when you look at outages in some of my MOU areas during Beryl, you call the city council. You call your city councilman or woman, and you have a place to go. And they're pretty responsive because they're elected. Same with cooperatives, right? They're elected boards. It's member-driven. But when you get to investor-owned utilities, who do you call? You call a hotline. We'll learn today how long you get to be put on hold, et cetera. And so I think when we look at this, they can't go to a local governing board. Instead, the utility commission, the Public Utility Commission, is the sole oversight. And so that's kind of what I want to hit on. At your open meeting last week, we heard from these investor-owned utilities about how resiliency will cost the ratepayers money, right? And much like Senator Betancourt, I'm not sure. When I look at the two buckets, capital expenditure where the profits are, which he eloquently went into, and went down into these leases and how much money they were making, versus the reimbursement, which has labor, contracts, things like that. So here's my question of the oversight on return on investment. Before each distribution cost recovery factor, that's known as the DCRF, right, is approved semi-annually, so twice a year. Does the commission ensure the utility spent the money in the manner they pledged?
So typically what we do on DCRF is that is meant to be an expedited process. We come back in a comprehensive rate case to ensure that all of that capital was deployed prudently.
So how long is that process?
So they have to, I think the schedule right now has that they are required to file every 4 years. If we get earnings monitoring reports. If our staff sees that they are over-earning based on their authorized rate of return, we can call them in to do a rate case. Also, if they believe they are under-earning, they can file a rate case.
Does that ever happen, either or?
So it's very rare that we call anyone in for over-earning. I would say it is often that a utility feels it is under-earning and has had a good amount of capital spend in the last 12 months, so they will file a rate case more frequently.
So if you look at investor-owned utilities, they're like any other for-profit company. They want to maximize their profits, right? So the way the formulas currently work, they get profits from those capital expenditures, while the others, like I said, labor and contracts only yield reimbursement. When you look at how that formula, and I actually have how that formula, it's right here, and it's pretty, all of you that are good at algebra, this is a good one. It would take you a while to solve it. But I ask this question about how that formula is created. And you look at what it currently does. In plain terms, not looking at this formula, but could you explain the rate of return allowed for distribution utilities in a manner that the average Texan, maybe even us up here, could understand?
Sure. So the way that the overall formula for rates typically works is they get a revenue requirement, how much revenue they need to run their utility. And the basic formula at a high level is their operating and maintenance spend for the last 12 months, because it's a historic test year for the last 12 months, plus whatever their capital expenditure is, with that number being multiplied by some rate of return. So in this case, say 9.5%. And so as that infrastructure spend that is prudent goes up, the equity shareholders' return on investment also goes up.
The chairman has said today that this is a utility. This is a utility. It is not like some of our other for-profit businesses. This is life and death. It is a monopoly, I think is what you said. And in my opening remarks, I'll just say CenterPoint, because that's what we're talking about today, is granted and guaranteed, as you said, typically 9.5. Senator Huffman and I were talking, I said it's around 10%. It's unbelievable. Guaranteed a 10% rate.
So they are guaranteed the opportunity to earn that rate of return. It's infrequent that they actually earn that much, but yeah, that's generally about right. Somewhere around 9 to 9.5% return on equity.
So with that, I would ask the PUC, is it time to change the formula to be more outcomes-based? Is it time? You said you were looking at other states. Is it time? And I'm going to quote you on your opening remarks, looking at incentives and do they align with customers? And I'm just going to tell y'all, obviously, what we saw during Beryl It does not align with customers. We all understand, those of us, I mean, I represent Tier 1, I have Tier 2 counties. We understand what a hurricane is. We understand what a tropical storm is. North Texas has the tornadoes. We occasionally get tornadoes as well. We understand outages. But to see the amount of time, and we can all talk about 18 inches, we can talk about all this stuff. We're going to change a lot of that stuff. We're going to change a lot of that. But I'm not sure that your formula, it is not time to change that. For them to say, hey, here's all of our paperwork, here's what we charge. I mean, what is the incentive? They are for profit. Their incentive is a return on investment to their stockholders. But for us up here, our incentive is that we allow them a rate of return, an absolute, almost guaranteed profit. I know that you're trying to say, well, it's not guaranteed. It's pretty guaranteed, right? And they have broken our contract because they have lost the trust of the people.
I would agree. There is very little risk on that return. What I would say to your other comments are, right now, I don't really feel like we have a performance-based system.
I don't either.
There is statutory language that says we can reduce their return on equity based on their performance. I asked my rates staff, my head of rates has been around close to 30 years. He remembers in his tenure maybe one time that has actually been used in an Entergy case. And so one of the items I asked him to look into is how we would figure out a way to measure performance, and if it is poor, what he would recommend the adequate way to address that in a rate of return would be. Now, right now, CenterPoint has an ongoing rate case, which, again, I can't talk about the specifics of, and, that type of thing may not be appropriate in what has already been filed, but I think it is something that is incumbent on the commission as the economic regulator to look into, again, to make sure that those incentives are aligned, because as the economic regulator, that is our primary job. We are a substitute for competition, and we need to make sure that that each utility is working as if they were in competition, because I think it's easy when you're a regulated monopoly, you don't actually have competition. Performance may not be at the top of mind. And so I think that's really, at the front of my mind, how we align those incentives with what the public expects.
Mr. Chairman, on Wednesday, July the 10th, Charles Richardson Anderson Sr., 76, died in Pasadena. So did Candace York, 50, died in Houston. Oscar Rodriguez, 78, also died in Houston. On the 11th, Charles Richardson Anderson, as well as Brian Keith Taylor, died. Christine Davis died. I think those are incentives. As my colleague said here, what's the greatest capital we have is human life. So I think that when we're going to talk today about resiliency, which we should, which is part of the problem but not all of the problem, I don't want this to be on the backs of the ratepayers in those service areas. It just can't be. We took, Mr. Chairman, you and Vice Chair King and those of us that serve on B&C, we're taking lots of the taxpayers' monies, and we have set up the Texas Energy Fund. And as Chairman King said, our Business and Commerce Committee spent so much time looking on generation. We just assumed in many ways that the resiliency was being done, but it's not profitable with these IOUs. And I think it's time to look at your formula and to have some clawbacks there on what, as you said, do the incentives, I think I'm quoting pretty closely, align with the consumer? And obviously, they did not during Beryl, and I don't think they do going forward unless we make major adjustments.
And Senator, I agree with you. One of the things I said in one of the press conferences I attended was, we'll do our investigation. Maybe some of this is their fault. Maybe some of it isn't. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because it's their responsibility. When you're providing electricity, you're not building widgets. You've made a compact with your customers, with the state, that you will provide electricity. And I think that's their responsibility to figure out how to do it reliably. And it is our duty as the commission to make sure that they do that through the incentives that we set up.
Chairman Gleason, I'm so glad you're in your position because you were actually the executive of the PUC. So you've seen it on both sides. And I think you have a unique opportunity to lead this agency, which obviously has been troubled for a while. I think Senator Bittencourt said maybe there were warning signs with CenterPoint. We've made a lot of changes to the PUC, and I look forward to your chairmanship, but I also challenge you to take a deep dive, just like we did after Uri, and we saw the vulnerabilities. We see the vulnerabilities in a Category 1 storm that cost many people their lives, and 2.25 million people without electricity for almost 2 weeks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Alvarado.
Mr. Chairman, this might be the first time that I make this statement, but I completely 100% agree with everything that my colleague, Mr. Bettencourt, just said. So, CenterPoint, you've brought us all together, Republicans and Democrats and everybody here. Mr. Gleason, do you have the timeline on the purchasing of the generators? Did CenterPoint purchase the generators before the PUC adopted the final rules and gave approval?
So yes, they bought or leased those prior to that. That's correct.
How is that?
So the way that rate cases work is use a historic test year. So they file a rate case that looks at the previous 12 months of costs, and then we decide on the prudence of those expenditures. If the commission at the time felt that those expenditures were imprudent, they could have denied them.
So, I don't see how they would make that huge investment before you have your final approval. Can you comment on that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the risk is on them. They have to make sure that they believe that they can make the case that what they've spent was prudently expensed. So that puts the risk on them, because if it's denied, they have to just eat those costs. But what I would say is, the law was passed to have them where they have the opportunity, they're allowed to, they're not required to, file resiliency plans. And what we do through that process, it's not exactly a pre-approval, but we have the ability to approve them, reject them, or modify them. So in theory, because to your point, it's such a large capital expense, I think the point of that legislation was to mitigate some of the risk for us to be able to tell them, yes, this seems prudent today. You'll still have to prove it up that it was prudent in a rate case, but somewhat of an understanding that, yes, that seems appropriate based on what you're showing us.
Looking back now, do you regret approving?
So I wasn't on the commission at the time. I would say if I was in the commissioner's shoes at that point, again, I think the context is important here. Coming off of Winter Storm Uri, I think that everyone was thinking not only about hurricanes, but we cannot let a Winter Storm Uri situation happen again. And so I think there was probably a desire to make sure that there was no second guessing on the other side of this issue, that we had another Winter Storm Uri last winter, and the questions would come on the other side. This just happened a few years ago. Why we passed this law? Why were you not prepared with the mobile generation you needed? So I see it on both sides. I do think we need to question how they made their decision compared to, say, other utilities like Oncor. I think that's fair to look at and figure out if they need to right size going forward what they've leased and procured. Because again, like I said to Senator Bettencourt, tornadoes, hurricanes are much more frequent than what we've heard from meteorologists a 50 or 100-year storm is. And so I think it's pragmatic and practical for them to spend more money and resources on the facilities that can address those issues that happen more frequently than a Winter Storm Uri situation.
Well, it just seems kind of arrogant to go out and make this huge investment, because then the PUC's probably, well, shoot, they've already spent all this money, legislation's been passed, and, at the time, of course, the legislation was, I think, it passed overwhelmingly, sure. Mr. King, almost unanimously, I think. And that, because sure, we all want generators. We want more resources during these storms, right? But the arrogance of making that huge investment before the PUC gave that final approval, I didn't know until, well, Chairman Bettencourt started down this path, but then we started in the short time just asking more questions. And I know as a legislature, we don't get into private business and how they do their bids. But it seems like this has raised some eyebrows. I understand that the bid process, that potential vendors only had 2 days to respond. Are you aware of that?
I'm not familiar with that. This was a while ago, but that sounds about right.
And Mr. Bettencourt also mentioned that the CEO of the company that had been selected had been convicted of a felony. It was for violating federal environmental protection laws in 2012.
Yes, and I will say those issues, to my memory, were brought up by interveners in this case, by other parties.
And what was CenterPoint's response to that?
That I'm not aware of. You may ask them.
I will. Thank you.
Senator Hinojosa.
Just a couple of questions. Are these $800 million generators mobile?
So they're intended to be mobile. One of the things we'll be looking at, I heard anecdotally that perhaps some of them are not as mobile as we had thought, and that's one of the reasons that CenterPoint had to borrow some from other utilities. I don't know the answer to that yet. That's one of the things we're going to look into.
Have they ever been used?
The large ones?
Yes.
I don't know the answer to that question. They can answer that, or I can get back to the committee on that.
I don't think they've ever been.
I would assume they have not been used since, again, the real purpose of those is for a Winter Storm Uri type event, and we have not seen one of those.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman,
Miles.
I've been waiting because I got a lot of questions.
Please.
Respectfully, thank you. Mr. Gleason, let me start off by, Chairman Gleason, thanking you for acknowledging and moving on the letter that was written by myself and my colleague, Senator Alvarado and Senator Cook, for the moratorium on the disconnects. So I want to thank you for that starting off. But, you know, in hearing all these questions about this contract and these generators, I feel like I need to, in the experience that I had in dealing with your office, I feel like I want to get this elephant out of the room, colleagues. And I think we all kind of feel it, but nobody's saying it. And I can tell you, I experienced it when trying to get this moratorium set. You know, I'm not quite sure. You can answer it if you want. You can answer it if you want, if you like. But colleagues, I'm not quite sure that, you know, PUC is driving the industry or is the industry driving PUC? And that's something we got to start thinking about. Because have you ever denied any one of those contracts? Have you ever denied any one of those requests?
So for the mobile,
in your history with
for the mobile generation specifically, you're asking? No, sir. Those were all allowed to go into rate base and paid for by ratepayer.
So, you know, we've got to start thinking in that manner, especially on this committee. Let me move into a couple other questions, and so we can move the day on. Why is it that when the TAC rules address the ban on disconnects when it was too hot or too cold, but it does not address a ban on disconnects after a natural disaster? Can you answer that question for me?
So I'm not sure that that was ever envisioned. Typically, what I'll say, my experience has been that utilities will voluntarily do a disconnect moratorium like you saw here. Mm-hmm. And as you referenced, you know, they had initially, I believe, planned to end that moratorium today. And I spoke to them prior to our open meeting about how they made that decision. And then in our open meeting last Thursday, they committed to extend it at least till Friday and then reevaluate. I will say one of the issues we have found, I've been at the commission for 16 years, is if we from the dais set a moratorium and we don't know exactly what's going on the ground, that can cause some unintended consequences. In fact, what we've heard from customers before is, you know, those bills keep racking up. And so if you have folks who have a hard time paying their bills and there's a moratorium on disconnects, they just get deeper in the hole. So we also want to guard against that. So I'll tell you what we felt in talking to staff, what I think the right answer is to work with the utilities to figure out if they can do this voluntarily in something where they can work with the customers, with the retail electric providers to make sure that that time certainty is set by them and not by us administratively from the dais.
So do you think that we may need to help as a legislative body to put something in legislation about disconnects as it relates to natural disasters?
I think that's something, if you all wanted to talk about, absolutely.
Yeah. And the moratorium, since I heard you said it may need to be extended. So did the industry have anything to do with that date that was set up on the 29th? Did they have any involvement in setting that date for you?
Did the industry?
Uh-huh.
So CenterPoint set that up on their own. That was what they put out.
Okay.
It was once I saw that put out, when I spoke to Mr. Wells and his
You just
staff.
kind of rode along with it?
Well, no, I talked to them about extending it, and then the decision for them to extend it was made in before our open meeting on Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
And so I asked them the question because I wanted it out publicly. We've talked about this. Do you plan to extend beyond next Monday? And that's when they articulated that they plan to extend it at least until this coming Friday.
Okay, that's understandable. One of the biggest complaints that my constituents complained about to my office was the fact that they were not given accurate information about restoration from CenterPoint. They were literally in the dark and figuratively in the dark. And I spoke to Lieutenant Governor about it, Mr. Chairman, about there was never any on their website. There was never any. They talked about restoration of population of restoration, but they never talked about areas of restoration. So does the PUC, does it have customer communication standards that transmission companies must meet? And if they do not, do you think we need to help you in that part as a legislative body as well?
So in their emergency operations plans, they have a part of that that talks about their customer communication during an emergency. What I will say is what they told us in our open meeting on Thursday was they only know about who 42% of their customers actually are, because most of the customer relationship is owned at the retail electric provider level. And so one of the things we discussed at the open meeting is how those two entities, the retail electric providers and the utility, can collaborate better, because that should be a really big resource for the TDUs to use. If they don't know who, it's hard for me to imagine a business can communicate effectively if they only know who 42% of their customers are. So we either have to find a way to change that so that they have direct, in an emergency, they have direct communication with their customers, or a way to leverage those existing relationships that the retail providers have so that they can adequately communicate with their customer base.
So are you telling me that we'll never be able to have even location tracking on restoration?
No, I'm telling you we should
Should.
have that, yes. And I think there are two issues here. One, their outage tracker should be accurate.
Right.
I think, we heard at the commission, a lot of the complaints we got were similar to what you've heard discussed. Either I got a text message saying I was restored and I haven't had power in 9 days, or I'm getting a text message saying you may be up in 24 hours, but my power's already come back on.
Yeah, because it would help me, because let me tell you, historically, the complaints come into my office that our areas are always hooked up last. And that's a heated discussion that the Lieutenant Governor and I had, colleagues, just last week. And we got to do something to fix it, because we want to make sure that everything is done evenly and equally. And there's no discrimination. And we can prove that historically that's not what's happening. Okay? But because we didn't have that data, what am I supposed to say to my people, my constituents?
I totally agree. It's one of the things I talked to our staff about. One of our goals should be to ensure that different communities are not having disparate outcomes in events like these. We said the same thing coming out of Uri, and the one
You said the same thing coming out of Uri.
Correct. That
sure
we
did.
should ensure, because there were all the stories about you could see certain parts of, say, Austin that never lost power, and then other parts that took a really long time to have power come back on. And
I remember those arguments.
Say again.
I remember those arguments.
Yes, sir. And so it's one of the things we have to figure out how they decide what needs to come back on first. I will tell you that what we heard a lot was we prioritize, say, where there are, hospitals and things like that. To be honest, those types of facilities tend to be near certain communities. And so that's one of the things we have to work with the utility on, and with you all, about how we address those situations. And to your point about figuring out when someone's going to come back on and how that can be useful, one of the differences between an event like this and an event like Uri is, with Uri, even if you had known when you were going to come back on, most of the roads were impassable. You were kind of stuck at your house. If you had known it may take 10 days, not 24 hours to come back on, you could have made other accommodations. You could have driven to Houston, or driven to Dallas, or driven somewhere else. in order to, be able to have electricity. So that's another thing where this is different than Uri because that information actually could have been acted upon.
Okay. I got just a couple more questions, if you don't mind. Would you agree with that? Agree with me that the moratorium was a big deal? It's a big success for the people who really, really are going to need it?
Yes, I think it is. It would not be good to ask people who have gone without power for an extended period of time to be able to receive service and then immediately lose their power again.
Then respectfully, sir, why was it on your website? Why was it not on your website?
The moratorium? I don't know. We don't typically put moratoriums on our website. Again, if that's something that we need to look at as far as our communication on our website, we're happy to do so. Typically, what we do is we use our social media to get that type of information out.
Do you know the people that have made complaints to PUC? Do you know how they were notified and how they were contacted with follow-ups?
From the utility?
Several people, when they called my office, I told them to contact PUC, gave them your information. So I know that there were some complaints filed. Do you know how they were followed up with, or if they were at all followed up?
So yes, sir. So if a complaint was filed, that would still be going through our informal complaint process, which has typically 30 days to work through the process.
So they should expect a formal complaint response?
Yes, if they filed an informal complaint, they will get a response from the PUC.
Okay, and last but not least, what is the PUC doing to enforce requirements that retail electric providers must provide all payment options and assistance to those customers that indicate an inability to pay their bills?
So that's another area where we typically rely on complaints. If we get a number of complaints that a retail electric provider is not following our rules or we will investigate that. If they're following our rules, we'll reach back out to that customer and tell the customer, this is within the rules, they're acting appropriately. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, which is a whole adjudicated process, you can do so, and we explain how to do that. If we find that that the retail electric provider is not following our rules, we will work with that company to provide money back to the customer who has been adversely impacted.
So, Ms. Gleason, I thank you for putting me at ease to know that all of my constituents that I forwarded on to PUC are going to get some type of follow-up response.
Yes, sir, and I'll commit that we will follow up with this entire committee about the complaints that we received during this and how they were resolved.
Thank you again. Thank you,
yes, sir.
Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Senator Miles. Senator King and Senator Braden.
Thank you, Chairman. And maybe this more in way of context than question, but I just wanted to remind us that how we came about the mobile generation, because that's been such a topic this morning. After Uri, House and Senate asked one very simple question of the TDUs, and it was, what were some of the tools that you didn't have that you wished you'd had in the toolbox for when that power was out? And one of the consistent responses was, if we had just had some mobile generation sitting on the back of an 18-wheeler trailer that we could wheel out to sites of essential service, whether that was hospitals or warming centers or cooling centers, if in the case of a hurricane, or law enforcement, or whatever it may be, or even maybe for small neighborhoods. And then the discussion was, if we had those for tornadoes and wildfires, we could roll them out for that. That was a really, really, really simple concept. And I think that was what everybody envisioned when the House and the Senate unanimously approved that legislation for that. I know I checked with Encore, and Encore bought 15 small units running from about 400 kilowatts to 1.2 megawatts. And I think their total cost for that was about $5.5 million, which is amortized over 84 months. I think it's like 600-something thousand a year. I've seen them roll those out in my district, tornadoes and other things, really with great success. And I know Encore had rolled theirs out previously with great success too when there's been events. So was a little surprised to learn that these large units, 30 megawatts and larger, had kind of been put into this bill. And so when CenterPoint comes up, I'd kind of like to, I'm hoping we'll hear some discussion about, because that's two different things. The small units are there to roll it out to a neighborhood or a facility when the power's out. Apparently the big units are for load shed when lines and poles aren't down, and that's to go in, and if the PUC or ERCOT issues an order to shed load, that they can turn on those larger units and keep a neighborhood or a community powered up during that time. So there's two different things here, right?
That's correct, yes. So the larger ones are used to connect at the substation so that the distribution lines can be re-energized if you have a major transmission issue. And I think, again, like I said earlier, the context is right. Coming out of Uri, I think what everyone envisioned, honestly, was a kind of all of the above approach. And so we'd probably be having a different conversation if we were here in February and this event wasn't a hurricane, but was another really massive winter storm. But I think what this brings to light is how were those decisions made as to how much of each type of mobile generation facility you procured. I think that's appropriate for us to ask, even though this is already in rates, because I think that will also help us inform what we do going forward, which I think is, at least from my standpoint, our investigation, we'll figure out what went right and how we can improve and what went wrong and how we can remedy that. But the real key to this is once we have that information, it has to be actionable. So we have to move forward in that light.
The other piece of this that I think really needs to be looked at is that you can only lease these generators. And so if you buy, a generator lasts a long time. So if you buy a, 400 kilowatt generator that you're going to roll out behind a small truck and hook up, those things are going to last for 25 or 30 years. The way they're set up for leases, they're only getting 6 or 7 years out of it. So they're paying a lot more, I'm suspecting. Have y'all looked into the cost difference between if they buy these things where they can buy them and depreciate them versus lease them where they're going to pay a lot more for it?
So I believe that they can speak to that. I know during discussions around changing the statute, CenterPoint in particular made the argument that it was cheaper in the long run to buy these facilities rather than lease them. And I would say you're right. It probably makes sense for the facilities you're going to use often for tornadoes or hurricanes. It probably does make sense to buy them instead of leasing them. For the larger units, I don't know that I'm sold on that anymore because to Senator Betancourt's point, you could buy facilities that are, you may use every 50 years that if you don't use them in the first 20 years, you're going to have to rebuy them anyways, potentially. And so I think that brings into question what the appropriate kind of mix of resources you need and how you would finance
The last
procurement.
question. Did y'all, when you overruled the administrative law court, was there discussion of whether or not the two different types both fit under the legislation? Was that one of the issues that was discussed in trial, that whether or not the large units, which were for load shed, actually fit within the legislation that was really intended just for small mobile units?
Vice Chair King, I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't remember the specifics of the arguments made. But like I said, I do remember that many parties other than the utility did push back on the amount that was procured and how much it would cost.
Was the pushback on the large units and not the small units?
My memory, it could be subject to check. My memory was just on the overall amount of needing to rate base that many megawatts of facilities.
But in CenterPoint's case, the vast amount of that cost was the large units.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are those large units mobile?
So that was the point I was making. In my mind, they were. All of these should be mobile. I had heard anecdotally that one of the reasons that they were not useful is because they're not actually that mobile. So that's something that's one of the issues we're going to look into. Do those large units actually meet the criteria that was set forth in statute and in rule to fall under the provisions of mobile generation?
Yeah, that's what I was getting at, whether that's consistent with statutory language. Senator Gray.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gleason, I wanted to go back up to a higher altitude for a moment, just for the benefit of those that are listening and watching. Can you explain, as we receive comments into our office, that what we experienced during the storm, the CenterPoint definitely in the focus of this discussion, the difference between a problem with the grid itself and problems inherent within being prepared for a hurricane and the aftermath?
Sure. Yes, sir. So this was not a system-wide failure. We didn't see, massive generation fall off. We didn't see other areas of the state impacted as significantly. This, I think, is more localized. And again, one of the things I think we need to talk about is, based on the location of these facilities, what is the right amount of hardening of the system that we need for coastal areas of the state versus potentially the rest of the state. This was not system-wide. This was localized to the coast, and within those coastal areas, different utilities perform differently.
So do you have anything to reference to let us know how, output was, how much electricity was available as far as in terms of megawatts during that week and a half? Or?
Yes, so we had enough generation to serve our full load. There was no lack of generation. If all customers could have been receiving power, there was plenty of electricity to provide those customers power.
We've had some references today to regulated versus deregulated, ERCOT, non-ERCOT. Can you just, with brevity, explain for those that are watching and listening why it has been mentioned several times that CenterPoint has a monopoly?
So within ERCOT, the wires and poles companies that actually deliver the energy are regulated utilities. Back in 2000, when the ERCOT region was unbundled, we now have 3 different levels. We have generators, we have transmission distribution companies that actually supply the power, and then retail electric providers that have the customer relationship and actually sell that power to, say, a residential customer. That's different from outside ERCOT, where Texas still has unbundled utilities, where the utility, one utility does the retail service, owns the wires and poles, and also owns the generation. And for those companies, we regulate all parts of that. In the ERCOT region, we only have regulatory authority to set rates for the transmission distribution companies.
So break that down even further and even more brief for the layman that is just, Mr. and Ms. Smith that are watching this hearing. How is it that CenterPoint has a service territory in the Houston region, and how is it that they are not required to compete with anyone in a otherwise what would be considered a deregulated ERCOT market construct?
So the trade-off is, for those regulated utilities, they have a monopoly service territory to invest in. The trade-off for that is we get to set their rates, as opposed to, say, a competitive area. If there was full competition, they would have to have competitive rates. And so the exchange for that is we get to set their rates and set how much return they should be allowed to get.
Very clear. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate the clarification on that. I think it's important for the public throughout this hearing that we continue to remind them exactly how this all fits together, because it's very confusing to those that have just gone through a traumatic experience and then to watch this hearing hoping to learn answers that will give them clarity or closure or just an understanding of how this framework works, so they can weigh into our offices and tell us their opinions. And so even though it seems like, those summaries are very well known, it's important to continue to go over them. For a service territory itself, how would CenterPoint's service territory be expanded or restricted?
So typically, we don't get, inside of ERCOT for TDUs, we don't get much change in their service territories. Most of the certificates of convenience and necessity, which give them their service territory, what we get in the inside ERCOT piece is mostly on facilities. So if they want to build new facilities, they have to go through that process. But typically, that's within their current footprint, not to expand out into other territories.
And so how would that footprint change?
So they would have to come to us and ask for a change in their service territory.
Or the legislature would take action to do the same, correct?
That's correct. There could be statutory change to affect their CCN.
To expand the CCN or?
Contracted as well.
Contracted.
Yes, sir.
Right. Is there precedent for that?
To be honest, not to my knowledge. There could be. I would have to check on that. I don't recall anything like that on the ERCOT side.
And that's okay. That's okay. You made reference earlier to the governor's letter, Chairman Gleason. Is that letter that you referenced from July 14th?
Yes, sir.
24. And in that reference, you mentioned several things the governor pointed out as priorities for his office and directives for your office. Is that correct?
That's correct. He laid out vegetation management, infrastructure and storm hardening, communications, use of mobile generation. I've also instructed staff, the Lieutenant Governor put out 10 questions that we also need to figure out answers to during the course of this investigation.
And so within those directives, as you mentioned, there was number one, is the cause of the magnitude and the duration of customer outages a result of physical infrastructure or personnel issue? Number two, what were the utilities' pre-event planning processes? Number three, why exactly were so many Texans left without power for so many days? And number four, when and for what purpose did utilities use their mobile generation resources? You're familiar with those questions, correct?
Yes, sir.
So in the letter, prior to those directives being listed, there's a reference to the PUC undertaking a rigorous study. Your words were an investigation. Do you see those as mutually exclusive, or do you see those as the same? And if the same, then how do you reconcile the difference between a study and an investigation?
So what I wanted to be clear with the governor on, and as I stated earlier, is typically when we say investigation, that's through an enforcement action. Our typical investigations are contested cases, similar to what we've talked about, where I can't speak right now on resiliency plans or a pending rate case. Typically, I can't speak to our investigations because ultimately whatever our staff finds will come before us for us to make a final judgment on. My sense of this in talking, I talked to the Lieutenant Governor before one of the press conferences, I talked to the governor, was that the goal of this should not be to do everything behind closed doors, then 6 months from now come out with an administrative penalty that just gets deposited to general revenue for $1 million. The goal here is to get answers to all of those questions, plus others that we develop in coordination with the legislature and the governor. Have that be in the daylight so everyone can see the questions we've asked and what those responses are. I think that will bring us closer to the change we need and the actionable information than doing an enforcement investigation that results in some minimal amount of money going to general revenue.
I think the daylight that you mentioned is incredibly important in using that rhetoric because the most important people involved in this process are not in this room. The most important people involved in this process are still recovering at home. And so that daylight and that sunshine, it just can't be overstated how important that is for your efforts to be an investigation, not just a study. And I'm very impressed with the governor's letter. I think it's spot on. But I think the difference between a study and an investigation is very important to highlight. And, you know, as chairman of the PUC, it's my understanding through my research that you have ultimate legal authority over ERCOT. Is that correct?
That's correct. We have complete authority over ERCOT.
Right. So tell me to what extent you have authority and investigative powers over exactly this type of research and microscope that you're planning on placing on CenterPoint on behalf of all Texans served. And I'll just say it in my district, in Senate District 4, I have 332,000 homes served by Entergy, non-ERCOT, and I have about 180,000 homes served by CenterPoint. So it's kind of a fascinating disparity on where my constituents sit within this problem, right? And a comparison of best practices and those that were not utilizing best practices. So this investigation is extremely important to all of us, but for Senate District 4 in particular. And the names of those that I mentioned are now deceased. I just want to impress upon you any way possible that this needs to be an investigation, not based on relationships or favors or hey, we've always done things the right way. This needs to be an investigation like there has never been before that the PUC will conduct to make sure that every rock is overturned and that we understand answers so that we can make decisions going forward. Is that your opinion as well, Chairman?
Yes, sir. Within our enforcement discretion, we have the authority to submit RFIs, requests for information from them on any topic that we wish. And again, those will all be public, what we ask and what the responses are. And to your point, yes, we shouldn't do this in a vacuum. This shouldn't just be stuff, issues that my staff comes up with. We need to be collaborating with you all, with the House, with the local officials. I talked to Mayor Whitmire at one of the press conferences about this. At the last open meeting, I impressed upon my governmental relations staff that they need to make sure that they're reaching out to mayors, county judges, local officials as well, because they're closer to this than anybody. And I think it's with all of that, comprehensive communication and input, we will get the best results to make sure that we can mitigate this ever happening again.
So, and I like your answers there. So for the governor's letter and the lieutenant governor's letter, both with directives, they both mentioned, and I'm very impressed with both of their correspondence, that the directives they list are not comprehensive. So in other words, they encourage the PUC to continue to develop based on those concerns and needs and the answers that we all need to recover as Texans. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think they were wise in not saying those are the only questions that need to be answered, though that's a starting place. So from there, we will branch out, like I said, and talk to multiple parties. We'll do, I've asked our staff to reach out to Florida Power and Light and other states' regulatory commissions about how they handle these types of things, because I think we can learn from how other people do things and then take that information and come up with a Texas solution for these problems.
Yeah, definitely needs to be a Texas solution.
Yes, sir.
Let Texas run Texas. So for the conversations that we've had, I think it's a complete gift that Chief Kidd and yourself have testified first, right? Because CenterPoint should be learning minute by minute what our concerns are, coming straight out of our districts, right? We all have over 1 million head coaches, and we're the team. And all those head coaches that we represent that have lost family members, that have struggled, that have gone through the hardships that they've faced through this storm, they expect answers, and they expect much more than us just to vet the problem, right? They expect action, and
yes,
quickly. So your directives are to have this study. Again, I keep saying the difference between a study and an investigation, the conclusions and the results of the findings of the investigation, which it should be, is due December 1st. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you expect that it could be complete prior to December 1?
Yes. It will. I believe it will be completed prior to December 1. And I would say this is not a one-off. I think one of the areas that we as a regulatory commission can improve on is we need to continually iterate these questions. As the grid is changing, as the conditions on the ground are changing, we can't do this one report and say, this is good. We will just assume that this static state is the way we can proceed until the next issue pops up. I think, we learned this in Uri because we had, outages in 2011. We made some changes, and I think we failed to continually analyze and iterate solutions. And then we had Winter Storm Uri. The learning from that is we can't say, great, we did weatherization, tick off on our checkbox, our checkboxes on a list and say, we're good now, and then wait for the next winter storm. Right. You have to continually iterate and analyze what's actually going on so you can pivot when you need to, not wait for the issue to arise. And so that's what the plan is here. This is the beginning of what we'll do. Hopefully we'll come up with best practices and things that can be done actionable now that CenterPoint does not have to wait to do. There will be issues that perhaps we at the commission need to do rule changes to address. And there will be, I assume, recommendations that need a legislative fix. Those will be in the report, and any of those that we believe need a statutory change, we will put in our agency report that's due to you all by January 15th of a session year as legislative recommendations in our report.
Well, I know there's been references to recovery from winter storms and polar vortexes, right? We've had 6 polar vortexes over the past 25 years. The last 2 have been the most significant to my knowledge. But the other side of that is we've had 10 named hurricanes and storms since Harvey. So it's our expectation that there is preparation for both. It's our expectation that with a potential to recover double-digit returns on profit, that these companies do what they need to do to protect the public. So last point, do you distinguish in your RFIs that would go out to CenterPoint for your investigation to be completed? Do you distinguish between any authority or powers within that RFI that would be different than subpoena power? In other words, is there any privileged information that they do not have to submit to you?
Not that I'm aware of. What I would say is if we did ask any questions through the RFIs where they did respond that way, we would discuss it with them.
If there is any privileged information that is not disclosed to you through those RFIs, I would like to ask you on the record in this committee hearing to let every senator on this dais know immediately when that answer comes back from their general counsel. Is that fair?
Yes, sir, it's fair. And again, those responses will be public. So if we get a response like that, the public will know as well.
It's great for those to be put out in the public domain. Sometimes they're found, sometimes they're not. I would like to request for myself and my colleagues that those formally come to our offices. Is that fair?
Yes, sir. And we will also be discussing this at our open meetings. So there will be spotlight on these responses.
Thank you, Chairman Gleason. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Just one quick point. You can administer as a commission administrative penalties, correct?
Yes, sir.
What dollar amount?
So we have a different authority. There are caps of 25,000 on some, others coming out of Winter Storm Uri, $1 million per day per event.
But for
I believe 25,000 would probably.
TDUs?
I believe for this type of event, 25,000 would be the cap.
Per day?
Per day, per event.
Okay. The rate of return calculation that's been discussed by Senator Colkhurst regarding outcomes-based, there's no obviously penalty structure regarding diminishing the rate of return as a penalty structure for efforts beyond what we would consider standard.
Correct.
That is not in law, correct? You
No,
cannot
what is in law is, and I think I referenced this to our rate staff, has only been used once in the past 25 years, is there is a provision in statute that if there is poor performance or management, we can address that through their authorized rate of return. So if
Has that ever been done?
I think it's been done once in the last 25 or so years, and that was on an Entergy case.
I'd like to have that information. If you could
Yes, sir.
find it. But it's not formalized statutorily that
So
y'all are able to do it, so there is some statute that allows you to do it.
there is, what I'm not sure of, if there's any kind of methodology for if X, then this is how you calculate what a reasonable return on equity would be.
So members, I'm getting to this counterbalance of a, regulated monopoly and the PUC being the economic counterweight to that. And obviously, people listen to the dollars, right? Especially if it's for the shareholders. And so how do you adjust that? And that's usually through the rate of return, penalties, or a combination thereof, service territory, other things. But we need to potentially look at those type of issues, this issue of mobile gen, right-of-way clearances, coastal standards for equipment and construction long-term going forward. There's a whole bunch of different items that are floating around that I think we have some fairly good unanimity, at least for thoughts of it. We should maybe address it this next session. Senator Nichols and then others.
Oh, thanks. First of all, we do appreciate the position you're in at the PUC. We followed you for a number of years. So my points are going to fall into really two categories, but before I say that, having a stable agency is extremely important, especially the one that you've got, because it just touches every aspect of the state. And we've made a lot of changes at the PUC just in the last 4 years. After Harvey, Uri, we had COVID, and you listed a number of the hurricanes and stuff and disasters. There's a lot of responsibility at these different utilities that we put on them. But we put the PUC, or the PUC is in the oversight. So you, in my opinion, y'all do have a responsibility to make sure that these people are operating, or entities are operating within certain standards. And so with that, I was gonna go until like number one. I know in running my businesses, I used to have a difficult time keeping up with a lot of stuff. So I was constantly had a series of matrices that would help my eyes and ears as something went out of whack. In other words, inside your organization, while you're reviewing the different costs, operating expenses and things like that, in the area, for instance, of resiliency, I'm not sure what all y'all are measuring and how y'all look at it. But if I'm looking at one utility and they're spending a certain amount of money per mile on vegetation expenses over a period of 2 or 3 years, and somebody else is spending either a whole lot less or a whole lot more, by the time you compare several of them, you've got somebody that's out of whack. Do y'all look at stuff like that?
So not within a specific rate case, right? So the rate case.
I'm not talking about in a rate case. I'm not talking about rate case here. I'm talking about as you're watching, you might see it at a rate case where you go back in and review it. And so are things that are way out of whack like that, do they pop up? Or?
Yes, so we track, for instance, vegetation management spend by utility. I referenced earlier one of the first filings we'll have in this investigation. I asked staff and they put together a comparison for all utilities from 2013 until 2023, what their vegetation management spend has been, what that is per capita, and what that is per line mile. So that'll be filed in this investigation.
But y'all haven't been doing that before?
So I don't know if our infrastructure staff regularly looks at, this utility is spending X, this is spending Y over the last 15 years. I don't know if that's happening.
Okay, but I'm assuming you will now?
Yes, sir. I mean, yes, we'll file this, and again.
But in the category of resiliency, there's a number of different things, vegetation management, the type of poles, above ground, below ground, the heights, that whole category. And there's even different categories of resilient poles and stuff. But I would think if it would be important, and I know we have a tendency to react to the disaster that we all just went through. I've been here numerous winter events, with freezing and things like that. And then, kid, no matter what the disaster is, you seem to always be here for good reason. But I think you're in a position, or your agency is in a position, if utilized, you could identify some weaknesses in some of these transmission distribution utilities.
So yes, I think one of the goals of the resiliency plan statute that was passed was for utilities to put into the category what will improve our resiliency, how much it'll cost, and then it's up to us ultimately to determine if those activities and that spend is prudent.
And so when they put in a resiliency plan, how long does it typically take to get an answer back to them?
So we have a statutory deadline once it is filed to either reject, modify, or accept within, I believe, 180 days.
Okay. And the second category, Mr. Chairman, kind of goes to where you were headed. There are incentives and there are penalties, whip and carrot. I'm one of the believers that carrots work better than whips. Punishing somebody is one thing, but incentivizing them long-term to invest in the areas that we are interested in, I think that's where Senator Betancourt was going, I think is a much better approach long-term because then it focuses them. The only other thing I can think of that might be better would be the competition, which is what we went to in the great bulk of on power generation. Now, I don't know really how we can have competition in the operation of those transmission lines, and that's one of the reasons we ended up with the structure we did, when they deregulated the ERCOT market. But there's a lot of smart people in this state who can come up with performance measures that probably could be incentivized, and instead of just paying somebody a rate of return on a large investment, it makes them, I mean, I can figure that out pretty quick. If I'm looking at my books, the more money I spend on capital equipment, the more I'm going to make. Why the rest of the expense, I don't get a return on, so why mess with it? That's the resiliency side. So hopefully y'all can work toward something. I've been sitting here making notes, trying to figure out how to do a performance measurement, and I'm not real sure because the disasters change so much. And the different geographic regions, like my district looks so much more differently than Senator King's district, and our issues are different. Do you have to have statutory authority to change the formula? Such as, instead of reimbursing based on how much you spend in capital equipment, reimbursing based on a performance measurement that might include customer service?
So I believe,
Like that?
and this would be again subject to check with my rate staff, I believe the general kind of tenets of how we do rate making are in statute. The individual components I know are in rule. I'm not sure about statute. And I would say, you know, the transmission distribution service utilities have an incentive to provide power. In their rate, there's a fixed component and a variable component. That variable component is dependent on how much electricity actually shows up at homes. My point is that doesn't seem to be a strong enough incentive to avoid these types of events happening. So we have to figure out whether we have to bolster some existing incentive or come up with a new set of incentives that they spend the proper amount of money and do the proper operation, you know, maintenance of their system to avoid these types of events in the future.
Would customer service in any form have any impact on the formula? Do you feel like it should be in there somewhere?
I think it's definitely a qualitative input that we should consider. As far as a quantitative one, I would hesitate a little more because my experience with our own surveys on performances, you hear mostly from the folks who are displeased and not so much from the ones who are happy with their service. So I want to be careful about that. But again, I think all these are good discussions to have because, you know, we've heard, and I think, you know, Chairman Schwartner may have mentioned this or referenced this, you know, we've heard a lot since the storm hit that how performance was during, you know, in 2008, 2009 for the last real wind storm we had. And the performance here was actually better. But the thing that's changed is the expectation. And so we have a new expectation for how reliable our system is. We have to come up with ways to meet that new expectation. What was good enough 15 years ago is not good enough anymore.
I know a great portion of my district. I've got regulated markets. I've got CenterPoint. I've got Entergy. I've got co-ops.
You've got everything.
I've got it all. It's a great district. I love my district. The co-ops have kind of, to me, the ultimate performance measurement in that the customers own the utility company. And so if they don't take care of those customers run them. I mean, they really do. Anyway, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Sure.
Senator Colcourse.
I have one quick follow-up. Thank you, Senator Nichols, about the statement about co-ops. That's for sure. They're very responsive. And I don't know. I guess Judge Keogh could answer this when he talks because he has Entergy, he has CenterPoint, and he has some co-ops. And we'll find out who was, yep, Mid-South. I was going to say Mid-South. So we'll find out which ones were most responsive. Which, does the PUC keep those, like how quickly, do they keep the stats on when a hurricane comes through?
Yes, so we have information through our representation at the State Operations Center that's embedded with Chief Kidd and Tatum. We get updates from municipal utilities, from co-ops, from TDUs. We get updates from all of them and have those because that helps us determine where we may need to let Tatum know resources need to be allocated.
I'd be interested to see those stats, especially with Beryl. And we all understand the path and who had higher winds than others, but I'd be very interested. I'm going to go back to what Senator Miles was talking about, the outage map. And I think, Mr. Chairman, you made a really good point, and Chief Kidd was nodding his head about the outage map and the importance of it, because you know that if you're going to be out of electricity for 9 days, you know that you have to make other plans. And those other plans can, my goodness, you might have family members. I ran into one of my classmates from the class of 1983, Brenham Cubs. She came to town and stayed with some of her relatives. I hadn't seen her in years. I said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "You know what? I'm not going to have electricity for about 10 days, and I needed to go find some place to stay." The problem with CenterPoint's outage map was the inaccuracies. I know, Senator Huffman, you and I had a discussion about that, and I'm going to ask this question. There's a lot of talk about the Whataburger app, okay? And I'm going to give them a little free advertising here, because you could go to the Whataburger app and you could see, wow, these Whataburgers have power. I can go get hamburgers over there, a cheeseburger. Senator Shortner likes cheeseburger. I try to save on the calories. I'm going to get a hamburger, okay? But here's the deal. So they have an app that people started using. They almost had to do a disclaimer to say, "Hey, don't use." I mean, like this is just for you to know where we're servicing, etc. Okay. My question to you is, that was a cloud-based app. We're now learning that CenterPoint has a physical server application, and it was woefully inadequate. We heard from our constituents. You heard. Literally, they were in the dark. Not metaphorical. They were in the dark. So my question to you on this is, it seems like cloud-based would be a subscription-based application, which would go in the bucket of I'm just reimbursed, by the other part being physical servers, and that goes in my capital expenditure bucket, which I get to make profit off of. True or false?
So my understanding is that is correct. I would have to look at our previous rate cases. A similar question got asked of me earlier today. It was the first time I'd actually been asked that question. So I would want to look and consult with my staff, but that's my understanding as well. And I would say, while we're thankful that the Whataburger app worked and helped people, I view that similarly to the way I view the idea that any part of a solution to this should be people going out and spending their own money to get a generator. If people want that as backup, that's fine. But the primary issue here is we need to be providing them power. So let's say, in this case, sure, if someone thought it was helpful because maybe they were questioning whether or not the information they were getting from CenterPoint was right or not, you just want to go check if a Whataburger has power, sure. But that should not be the primary way we deal with this issue, nor should telling everyone to go buy a Generac. Those things should not be how we deal with this.
You just made my point. When we're talking about very complicated formulas, like the one that I see here is the DCRF, which we've talked about, which Senator Nichols was just hitting on, and different things. Just something so simple as having an app, an outage map, something that I can go to and say, wow, they're working in this part of the state, this part of Houston. I'm not going to have electricity for X amount of time. I need to make plans for my children and me. Or like the couple that called us from New Jersey, who asked us about their elderly parents in Fort Bend County. They were working so hard from thousands of miles away to figure out how they were going to help their elderly parents. The husband needed to go to a cooling station. The wife wouldn't leave because she didn't want to leave the animals, risking her own health, okay? If we could have had an app to tell them, hey, listen, we're really in trouble here. You're 9 days out, 10 days out. We think we're going to get electricity. We don't have to call the Fort Bend, all the folks in Fort Bend who helped us, and we called TDM, what's the best plan of action, etc. And that's just one example. All of our staffs did dozens of those cases. But if we're talking about Whataburger being more efficient And that when we really boil down to it, they're using physical servers because they get a 10 or 9.5% profit off of it versus a subscription that is only reimbursed. I don't know. We got a lot of work to do. And that goes back to how I think our formula should be reworked, and incentives, as you said, Mr. Chairman, incentives align with the consumer. The simplest thing I think I could hear, and I heard over and over on the phone, was, could I just know where there's power and how quickly, just give me an estimate. It's kind of like a package being delivered from UPS today. You don't have to tell me what moment it's going to come here. I just need to know what day and the range of time. We can do better. Would you agree?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Quick,
Senator Vadencourt.
Yeah, quick couple follow-up for both of you gentlemen. Since follow-up, Senator Colkhorst, on the outage tracker, I believe Lieutenant Governor told me same thing from both of y'all different times, that what your understanding was that the outage tracker, that CenterPoint, when it went down, we were all told, or I believe the three of y'all were told, that it would not be up until actually till the beginning or the conclusion of the hurricane season. Gentlemen, could you confirm that?
So I was told that they were in the process of developing one, and I believe the last update I got was that it should be ready by August 1st.
Yeah, but what was the initial understanding, that it was not going to be ready until?
So I'll be honest, I don't remember hearing that. I know when I asked, they said it typically would take multiple months, and they had asked that it get done in 2 months from when they let the contract.
That's the same information, sir. I don't know that I have a specific date.
Right, so when the server-based unit went down, this was, of course, hurricane season already started, and we're in the middle of it. And so the question is it, if they rush it, is it 2 months, or is it going to take 4 months? And that's a pretty bad management decision by any measurement I understand.
So my assumption, absent any additional information, is they will have a tracker that is up and running August 1st. I think it is fair to question, should they have fixed their server issue in lieu of having nothing working during hurricane season?
And that would be a question for Mr. Wells, and
Yes, sir.
it would have been for Madam Lynette if she was still employed, because I'd like to understand what that decision was made, Chairman Wells, why it was not made, before the season, the fact we're in the middle of the season. Any type of post facto response is just preposterously bad management decision. Mr. Kim, since you've been quiet the whole time, was the state prepared and met any of the city and county requests that were given to OEM?
Yes, sir.
Do you have any other comments on today's testimony, and if there's anything else from the legislature that you think you need?
So thank you. It's been my experience that the only thing worse than no information is bad information. And I would ask that either through the PUC or the legislature, we address this topic. Our public needs to know when resources and utilities are expected to return. And I'll say it again, the only thing, in my experience, the only thing worse than no information is bad or wrong information.
That's correct, because to summarize what I think Senator Nichols was trying to say, something I've said many times: what gets measured gets fixed.
And Senator, again, our local partners have been phenomenal through this entire process and every disaster that we deal with. The judges that you're going to hear from, emergency management directors for their communities, whether they ran on that platform or not, that's what they are. And I appreciate their cooperation and support with us in every disaster. And hurricane season does not end until November 30th this year.
Right, and we have been in it and still are in it, and it doesn't miraculously start on August the 1st, even though that's our higher season. And I just am astonished and just aggravated to no end about some of these management decisions, but I'll save that for Chairman Wells.
Members, any other questions? Senator Middleton, and then Senator Alvarado. Sure. And then Senator Zaffarini.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, Thomas, I had a question. So the Chairman Schwartner pointed out that the PUC has some authority to go after their reasonable return. I guess that's sort of like the clawbacks Senator Betancourt talked about. And, we've already seen an estimate that, up to 80% of the mobile gen was not deployed, so we paid for, a lot for something that only 20% was functioning like it was supposed to be. And I think that number of profit was 50 million, something like that for CenterPoint. But Senator Colcourse talked about something else that's probably the first thing that all of our constituents look at. When their power goes out, they go look for an outage tracker, right? And so the question is, how did they account for that? So Texas, New Mexico has cloud-based, right? So theirs worked the whole time. I think there was like one issue they had for a few hours one day. And that is on the, obviously the operation side, so that's an operation expense. And I think with that, am I right that you just recoup your actual cost? There's no profit in that.
Correct. On the O&M side, you get recovery of your expense, not return on your expense.
Right, so you're just getting, you know, the actual expense. But with a capital cost, you get that 9.5% return. And so is it correct if it's firmware, servers, something that's physical asset, are they getting their 9.5% return on that?
That's correct.
So they got their 9.5% return on something that wasn't working, and they essentially defrauded their ratepayers, because that's the first thing we look for. That's the first thing anyone does when their power goes out is they go, is there an outage tracker? Let me go look at the map. Let me go type in my address. And none of that was working. So that's something else besides mobile gen that we need to look at, where it's disturbing to think that they may have chosen something that was likely to break, firmware, for that 9.5% return. So that's something I hope the PUC looks into and examines, and why the other transmission distribution utilities chose, you know, cloud instead of firmware. So was their incentive and their motivation just to get that 9.5% for something that wasn't working for our constituents? And they took their money and all of our money and didn't provide the product that they promised. In fact, it's one of the most essential, because it was what Senator Colcourse was talking about. People couldn't plan. They didn't know. You know, I mean, I always said, you know, if you think you need a cooling center, you need a cooling center. But people are under the impression that maybe I'll get my power back tomorrow, you know. And unfortunately, we have some people that aren't with us anymore because of that. That's one of the consequences of this. This is not just a convenience thing, or, you know, I want to know, you know, throw stuff out of the refrigerator. No, this is life and death issues. So if you could look into that for us and see how much they asked from the PUC on that hardened capital cost for the outage tracker.
Yes, sir.
Senator Alfredo.
Just a quick question on, during the May derecho and CenterPoint's outage tracker failed, it wasn't working, right? Did the PUC intervene and say, you've got to fix this and you have X amount of time to do it?
So I would need to check with staff. I was not aware that their outage tracker was out personally until I went to the press conference with Chief Kidd and the Lieutenant Governor. I was going to, in my prepared remarks, was going to reference the outage tracker, and was told as I was walking in that it wasn't working. So that was the first time I knew about it. That's typically not something that a commissioner may get told. I would have to check with our staff to see if that had ever been told from CenterPoint to agency staff prior to Beryl.
Well, because the public knew, we all knew.
I think people knew when they went to it and they weren't, and it didn't come up. I personally didn't go check their outage tracker during the storm.
Okay. Well, once you learned about it, was there any communication with CenterPoint?
There was. We discussed how quickly it would get up. I did ask, you know, what was the thought process between using this intervening period to switch, and I think the thought was that even if they put back the existing one, it would be overloaded again and just fail again. So the thought was, once it failed, start the clock running on, let's update this and get the cloud-based system. The storm just came before it was done.
Okay. Thank you.
Dean Zaffarini.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Gleason, I have a copy of the report filed by CenterPoint Energy Houston to the PUC on May the 1st, 2024. Are you familiar with that report?
Perhaps, do you know the title of it?
It is called the Report for Vegetation Management Plan pursuant to Texas Administrative Code.
Yes, they follow vegetation management plans with
Okay.
us.
On page 8 of that report, they say that their plan is to address a minimum of 3,500 miles of distribution circuits for tree trimming each year. And then on another page, on page 13, they state that they have 29,270 miles. Now, this was in May, way before the storm. Would 3,500 miles be an adequate goal?
No, ma'am, I don't believe so. My understanding is they use a risk-based analysis for what they're going to inspect and ultimately what vegetation management they do. My assumption would be that they've prioritized that vegetation which they think it could be most hazardous to their system.
On page 14 of the same report, it says CenterPoint Houston successfully met its 2023 goals as noted in the previous section. However, there were challenges. Looking back, would you agree that they met all of their goals for 2023 adequately in terms of preparation for the storm in Houston?
I think what I would say now is they met their internal goal. I would now posit that the goal is insufficient, that the goal needs to be more, and they need to spend the money, and we need to make sure that they spend the money to address a larger portion of their vegetation quicker.
And their plan is to double the 3,500, but that's still 7,000. Only 7,000 of 29,000 and more miles. So thinking about that report and other sections of it, and thinking of the investigation that is underway, are you going to go back and look at this report and look at other weaknesses as part of your investigation?
Yes, ma'am. I think we need to better understand how they come up with that goal, why they think that is the sufficient goal, and then obviously, like you said, they've committed to doubling that. Why not go further than that? I think those are all reasonable questions that, yes, we will endeavor to answer through our investigation.
We talked about the profit that they made, that CenterPoint Houston made in terms of leasing the mobile generators, especially the large ones that they did not use during the storm. Do you think that they should use that profit to pay for the vegetation mitigation going forward?
So what I'll say is, I don't want to prejudge any rate case that they have. Obviously, I can't speak to the one that they currently have before us. I think we need to find a way to ensure that they're doing all the vegetation management that they need to do. There's not a science to that. I think we need to work with all of the utilities and figure out how they determine what their schedule is, and then it is our job to tell them whether or not that is sufficient. I would agree that we have not held them to a standard that would be considered sufficient.
Thank you. Well, here's something else that is not rocket science. In a letter to the governor, CenterPoint Houston wrote, their pillars of action plan regarding resiliency investments, best-in-class customer service communication, and strengthened partnerships would be part of what they're planning for the future. Do you believe that those are adequate in terms of a plan?
I think that they need to do all those things. I don't think that that is comprehensive.
What would you add?
Sorry, ma'am.
What would you add to that?
So I think and again, I know we're focusing on CenterPoint. The governor's letter talked about the entire kind of Houston and Gulf Coast area, and I would think about it even just statewide. I think we need a comprehensive look at how we fund utilities, how they prepare for storms. Look at their communication. I know for a fact that they were in communication with retail electric providers during the storm about how to better communicate with customers, but that was being done in real time during the storm. The right time to get these systems in place is not during the storm. We have firsthand experience at the commission with that. We had really no communication plan for emergencies during Uri. We had one, as you all have heard me testify about a lot in Senate Finance, we had one communications professional heading into Winter Storm Uri. That was not sufficient. Coming out of that storm, we've bolstered that. We've changed the way we do our typical day-to-day communication and our communication during emergencies like this or, any type of ERCOT potential issue. I think that is a place where they have got to really dig down and look, because my experience has been, sure, we can't have 2.2, 2.3 million customers without power for this long. But if you effectively communicate with folks, you will, one, get a lot of grace for how you're doing, but two, if they feel like you are giving them accurate information, they can make the proper accommodations and if they want to leave, they can leave. If they want to hunker down, they can hunker down. But that's up to them. When they don't get adequate information, they cannot make informed decisions, and that is a major problem.
Thank you. Looking at the region that CenterPoint serves beyond Houston, do you have an opinion regarding whether the size of that region should be studied and considered?
No, ma'am. At this point, I don't. My experience with CenterPoint prior to this has been very positive with their communication and with their restoration efforts. I think that's why it's important to look at this kind of acute onset event and what worked and what didn't work, and then try to learn from that so that we can take those learnings and apply them statewide.
Would you support a requirement that electric utilities in Texas all have reliability and resilience measures for the regions they serve?
Yes, ma'am.
All of them?
Yes, I think it's important that customers know what kind of reliability they can expect. Yes.
Thank you. Looking forward, what plans and what actions do you think that this committee should take, and what recommendations should we make to the legislature at this point before your investigation is complete? I know that there'll be different later.
So the first is on communication. I think, that's not something that needs statutory change, but I think it is something that can be done immediately. I know CenterPoint has told me they're taking steps to improve their communication going through the rest of this storm season. I think the recommendations on how to better communicate with their customers, who are your constituents, who you hear from, who we hear from, is something easy that can be actionable right now. I think the other thing that should be focused on and really looked at is how we are setting up these economic incentives. I know I've talked about it a lot today, but for our purview, and we've talked a lot about B and C and Chairman Schwartner's committee that has jurisdiction over us. I think this committee can look at our investigation and any other information to give recommendations to the legislature to statutory changes that need to be put in place to improve resiliency. If that's changes to the resiliency plan statute, if that's metrics, anything like that that can ensure in statute and give the PUC, as it produces rules, some direction as to where those need to go. Because again, their customers are your constituents, you hear from them. So I think you all and local officials are very well positioned to provide that input to us.
Thank you. And speaking of local officials, are you including municipalities and all local governments in your investigation?
Yes, ma'am. We will expand it to municipalities and local governments. And as I stated earlier, what I've committed to, what I've asked our governmental relations staff to do is reach out to all the local officials in these areas, mayors, county judges that have been impacted, to see what they're hearing on the ground and how we can use that information to inform where our investigation goes.
Thank you. And this is for both of you. August 1st is supposedly the official date for the start of hurricane season. So as we prepare for it, what lessons learned can we report to other electric utilities based on what you've learned here in Houston?
So I think the most important one is to expect that these storms are going to hit you. One of the things that we will ask through this investigation is, was there adequate preparation, or did any of the utilities really believe this wasn't going to really impact them and therefore were inadequately prepared to deal with it? I think, and Governor Patrick mentioned this in one of the press conferences, I think what this teaches us is all utilities, if you are anywhere where you think a storm could hit, need to be prepared to address the issues that come along with that storm and not potentially wait until it's too late to address them, because once a storm hits, we're too late into this and we cannot react anymore. We need to be proactive and expect it to hit us, not reactive once it hits us.
Thank you. Chief?
Yeah, Dean Zaffirini, the Atlantic hurricane season, June 1st to November 30th. But that's not the only time we're impacted by disaster. And what I hope that others that are listening to this here is local offices of emergency management should be the first place they communicate. Their senior leadership should be tied to the State Emergency Operations Center. And you should, in Texas, we position our resources ahead of need. We don't wait for the call to ask for help. We make sure that we know what the possibilities are, what the most likely scenario is, what the worst case scenario is, and we plan for one step greater than whatever that worst case scenario is, to make sure that we've communicated early, we've communicated effectively, and we don't leave our partners in the dark.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dean. Members, any other questions? Senator Green.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quickly, I just wanted to ask you, Chairman Gleason, you mentioned the cap on fines for and penalties being at 25,000 a day. Is that correct? Do you feel like that's sufficient in the circumstances where those fines are levied? And if not, what would the appropriate fine be to just not be considered a cost of doing business?
So yes, I believe it's currently 25,000. Again, we'll have to endeavor. To see if any rules or statutes were broken, that this would even rise to an enforcement case. As we learned during Uri, I don't think $25,000 per day per event is a deterrent enough to impact decision making. I think it's maybe part of a suite of deterrents that we hope are useful in deterring, in incentivizing, providing the proper incentives for utilities to invest the way they need to. I don't know that I could say a specific number right now. I know, like we talked about with Uri, $1 million per day event was changed during the 21 session. I think I'd want to look into that before I committed to a specific number. But no, I don't believe $25,000 per day per event for violations is significant enough to probably change behavior.
Thank you, and please continue to give some thought to that, and my office will work with yours on any recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. That penalty, matrix that was instilled with SB3 is consistent with FERC, if I remember correctly.
That's
I'm not
correct.
for sure what FERC's regulatory penalty matrix is. For TDUs in certain situations, but we're going to find out. So,
Yes, sir.
members, any other questions? Thank you, Chief Kidd and Chairman Gleason. Chair calls Judith Talavera, President, Chief Operating Officer, American Electric Power, Texas. Ellie Villamontes, Chief Executive Officer, Entergy Texas. Jason Wells, Chief Executive Officer, CenterPoint Energy, Texas.
afternoon, Mr. Chairman and committee
Wait,
members.
one second. Just letting everybody move around here. So y'all have three to 10 minute prepared marks, and members will try to let them get through this, and then I know there's a lot of questions for I know Mr. Wells, and I'm sure the others as well. Ms. Talavera.
Thank
Go ahead,
you, Mr.
please.
Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Judith Talavera, and I'm the president and operating officer of AEP Texas. We're the transmission and distribution utility that serves much of South Texas, just south of San Antonio, and we have a large footprint in West Texas. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share with you how we prepare for storm events and then specifically our response to Hurricane Beryl. I would also like to express my heartfelt thoughts to all the Texans who were impacted by the storm. Safety is of the utmost importance to us in our industry. When our employees leave home,